There is a profound silence where the sky meets the water, a place where the world forgets its troubles and only the breath of the tide remains. Long before the world turned its anxious eyes toward the South Pacific, the waters of the Coral Sea knew nothing of the heavy things of men. It was, and always has been, a vast and gentle canvas of shifting blues. In the quiet of the morning, the water reflects the softest shades of lavender and apricot as the sun stretches over the horizon. The surface rolls in a slow, eternal rhythm, untouched and unbothered, breathing in time with the turning of the earth. The seabirds glide on invisible rivers of warm air, dipping their wings toward the whitecaps, while beneath the surface, ancient coral reefs sleep in the silent, sun-dappled shallows. It is a place of absolute peace. Yet, far away from this quiet expanse, the world was growing restless. The air was thick with the gathering storms of a conflict that was spilling over the edges of continents, reaching out like a slow shadow across the map. But for the boys and young men who were stepping away from their homes, the grand designs of history felt very far away. History was a thing that happened in grand rooms, spoken by older men in heavy coats. For these young men, the world was measured only by what they could hold in their hands, what they could see from the rails of a ship, and what they carried in their hearts. Imagine the mornings they left. The damp, salty fog rolling over coastal ports. The smell of burning coal, thick canvas, and polished leather. Young men, barely out of their school years, walking up the steep, narrow gangways onto great gray ships that seemed like iron mountains floating on the tide. Some of these boys came from towns surrounded by endless fields of wheat, from places where the highest point was a grain silo and the ocean was only a picture in a library book. To them, the salty air was a strange, sharp perfume, and the shifting deck beneath their boots felt like walking on the back of some great, sleeping beast. They carried duffel bags stuffed with scratchy wool blankets, neatly folded uniforms, and a few small, precious tethers to the world they were leaving behind. Deep in a breast pocket, pressed close to the heart, you would find a photograph with bent corners. A girl in a summer dress, smiling on a porch. A mother standing in front of a modest house. A little brother holding a wooden toy. These small rectangles of paper were anchors, heavy with love, keeping them tethered to the solid ground even as the ropes were cast off and the distance between the ship and the shore began to widen. As the coastline faded into a thin, gray smudge on the horizon, a strange and quiet feeling settled over the decks. It was not panic, nor was it the fiery spirit of battle. It was a profound, sprawling loneliness, mixed with the quiet awe of the open sea. The earth they knew was gone, replaced by an endless, sweeping dome of sky and water. The ships, massive as they were, suddenly felt very small against the infinite blue. And across that same vast ocean, leaving different ports with different shapes against the sky, other young men were feeling the exact same breeze against their faces. They stepped onto their own steel decks, breathing in the same salty air, feeling the same nervous flutter in their chests. They, too, were leaving behind quiet homes, perhaps a street lined with quiet trees, or a coastal village where the sound of the waves had been their childhood lullaby. These young men carried their own tender anchors. A small, beautifully folded note tucked into a pocket. A 1,000-stitch belt, painstakingly sewn by mothers, sisters, and neighbors, each red stitch a silent prayer for a safe return. They leaned against the rails of their ships, watching their own shorelines disappear into the mist, their thoughts drifting back to the smell of wood smoke in the evening, the taste of a familiar meal, the warmth of a loved one's hand. If you could strip away the gray paint of the ships and the uniforms they wore, you would find the same beating hearts, the same quiet hopes, the same longing for the day they could turn around and go home. Life on the water quickly settles into a gentle, swaying routine. The ocean demands a rhythm, and the sailors surrendered to it. The great ships became floating towns, completely isolated from the rest of humanity. Inside these steel walls, the air was warm and smelled of machine oil, strong coffee, and baking bread. The deep, continuous hum of the engines became a constant companion, a steady, thrumming heartbeat that vibrated through the soles of their shoes and into their bones. At night, lying in their narrow canvas bunks, that low vibration became a lullaby, soothing the tired minds of boys who missed their own beds. The days were filled with the simple, mundane tasks that kept the floating towns alive. Peeling potatoes in the galley, the repetitive scraping sounds mixing with quiet chatter and sudden, easy laughter. Sweeping the endless lengths of the decks. Painting over patches of rust that bloomed like flowers in the salt air. In these quiet moments of everyday labor, the war felt like a distant rumor. They were just young men doing chores, teasing each other, sharing stories of their hometowns, and waiting for the mail call. Ah, the mail. The letters were the most precious currency on the ocean. When the sun began to dip low, painting the sky in brilliant hues of violet and gold, you could find sailors tucked into quiet corners of the ship, sitting cross-legged on the steel decks, finding the best light to read by. A letter from home was a miracle. It was a piece of the world they loved, magically transported across thousands of miles of empty water. They would read them slowly, tracing the familiar handwriting with their fingertips, savoring every ordinary detail. And when they wrote back, sitting by the dim, red glow of the night lights, their pens scratching softly against the thin paper, they did not write of grand strategies or the looming shadows of conflict. They wrote of the weather. They wrote about the stunning, impossible color of the water, a blue so deep and rich it seemed to glow from within. They asked about the garden back home, about the neighbor's new dog, about whether the roof had been fixed before the spring rains. They wrote to protect the people they loved. They swallowed their private fears, the quiet anxieties that crept in when the night was darkest, and instead painted pictures of a peaceful, exotic adventure. "Do not worry for me," they would write, the ink sometimes feathering slightly in the humid sea air. "The food is good, the sea is calm, and I am watching a beautiful sunset. I will be home before you know it." They folded these little pieces of bravery, sealed them, and sent them out across the water, tiny bottles of hope cast into a vast ocean. When night fell over the Pacific, it brought a kind of beauty that words can barely capture. Far away from the artificial lights of cities, the sky opened up into a towering dome of glittering frost. The stars were not just points of light, they were a thick, sweeping river of diamonds spilled across the velvet dark. The Milky Way glowed so brightly it cast soft, silvery shadows on the decks. For the men standing the midnight watch, the world shrank down to the sound of the water parting at the bow and the gentle hiss of the wind in the rigging. Looking down, they would see the ocean answering the sky. Bioluminescent creatures, disturbed by the passage of the great ships, churned in the wake, leaving a trailing path of glowing, ghostly green light. It looked as though the ship was sailing on liquid starlight. In these quiet, lonely hours, standing shoulder to shoulder with a friend, the silence was a comfortable blanket. They might share a whispered conversation, their voices hushed so as not to wake the sleeping ship. They talked of the futures they wanted to build. The girls they wanted to marry. The small, quiet lives they wished to return to. The ocean listened, vast and indifferent, keeping their secrets in the dark. As the days turned into weeks, the fleets drifted slowly, steadily, toward the warm waters of the Coral Sea. The air grew heavier, sweeter, carrying the faint, tropical scent of rain and distant, unseen islands. The sea remained calm, a sprawling expanse of mesmerizing blue, betraying nothing of what lay ahead. It was simply water, holding the ships in its gentle embrace, rocking them as it had rocked the earth since the dawn of time. The young men looked out at the horizon, shielding their eyes from the glare of the sun. They did not know the names of the reefs they were passing. They did not know the coordinates on the map. They only knew that the ocean was beautiful, that the breeze was warm, and that tomorrow was another day of sweeping decks and waiting for a letter. They were drifting into the quiet shadow of history, but in this lingering, golden moment, there was no fear. There was only the gentle sigh of the wind, the rhythmic pulse of the engines beneath their feet, and the endless, soothing roll of the sunlit ocean. In the hidden, windowless corners of the world, the heavy fate of ships and men is carried on the delicate, invisible threads of static in the night. Far away from the sunlit decks and the open, rolling blue of the Pacific, there is another world where the war is being fought. It is not a world of fresh salt breezes or the vast, starry heavens. It is a world buried underground, tucked away in the damp basements of administrative buildings, hidden behind heavy steel doors in quiet, unassuming neighborhoods. Here, the air is thick and still, smelling of ozone, stale tobacco, and the metallic tang of typewriter ribbons. The only breeze comes from the slow, rhythmic hum of electric fans oscillating in the corners of the room. In these subterranean rooms, time has lost its meaning. There is no sunrise or sunset to mark the passing of the hours. There is only the soft, yellow glow of desk lamps casting long shadows across mountains of paper. And beneath these lamps sit the tired, pale men and women who hold the universe in their ink-stained hands. If you were to walk into one of these rooms, you would not hear the roar of engines or the crash of waves. You would hear a profound, suffocating quiet, broken only by the frantic tapping of typewriter keys, the shuffle of index cards, and the faint, ghostly hiss of static leaking from heavy, black headphones. These are the listening posts, the secret sanctuaries of the codebreakers, the quiet guardians of the fleet. The people who work here are not the typical heroes drawn in the storybooks of war. They are not broad-shouldered sailors or daring aviators. They are musicians who understand the hidden rhythms of the world. They are chess players, mathematicians, linguists, and school teachers. They are quiet people with soft hands, accustomed to the silence of libraries and the gentle rustle of turning pages. They wear rumpled shirts with sleeves rolled up to the elbows, their eyes red-rimmed and heavy with exhaustion. Imagine a young woman sitting in a small, isolated booth. Her shoulders are hunched, her eyes closed, pressing the headphones tight against her ears. She is listening to the ether, tuning into the vast, invisible ocean of radio waves that blanket the earth. Through the crackle of atmospheric storms and the humming of the deep, she hears it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. Morse code. It is an enemy ship, thousands of miles away, whispering into the dark. To anyone else, it would sound like a chaotic, meaningless swarm of insects. But to her, it is a voice. She does not know what the voice is saying, for the words are scrambled into a baffling sequence of random numbers and letters. Her job is simply to catch the whisper before it fades into the void. Her fingers fly across the keys of her typewriter, transforming the invisible taps into rows of neat, black ink. 5 letters. Space. 5 letters. Space. It is an exhausting, maddening rhythm. She sits there for 8, 10, 12 hours at a time, drinking lukewarm coffee from a thermos, ignoring the ache in her back, terrified that if her concentration slips for even a fraction of a second, a vital piece of the puzzle will be lost forever. When her shift finally ends, she gathers her pages, a thick stack of absolute nonsense, and carries them down the hall to the decryption room, a place the workers affectionately call the dungeon. In the dungeon, the air is even heavier. Long wooden tables are covered in a blizzard of paper. Thousands upon thousands of intercepts, cross-referenced with ledgers, charts, and walls covered in pushpins and colored string. Here, the puzzle solvers take the scrambled messages and begin the slow, agonizing work of untangling them. It is a quiet, desperate kind of agony. They stare at columns of 5-letter groups until the characters begin to swim and blur before their eyes. They look for patterns, for repetitions, for a single, tiny crack in the armor of the enemy's code. It is like trying to read a book in a language you do not speak, in a room where the lights keep flickering off. The emotional toll of this work is a silent, heavy weight that rests on their chests. They are civilians and junior officers bound by an oath of absolute secrecy. When they leave the basement and step out into the blinding light of morning, blinking like owls in the sun, they must walk back to their small apartments and pretend. They are perfectly ordinary. They pass their neighbors on the street, smiling politely, knowing that the neighbor thinks they are merely filing papers or doing accounting work. They cannot tell their families what they do. When they write letters to their own loved ones, sitting at a kitchen table while the rest of the house sleeps, they cannot explain why their handwriting is shaky from fatigue, or why they cannot come home for the holidays. They are entirely isolated by the secrets they carry. They are ghosts, moving through the civilian world, their minds forever anchored to the dark basements and the endless rows of numbers. And in that isolation, a strange and beautiful camaraderie blooms in the dungeon. They care for one another with small, quiet gestures. A hand placed gently on a trembling shoulder. A fresh pencil sharpener left on a desk. A shared orange, peeled and divided in the dead of night, its bright, sweet scent cutting through the stale air. When one of them rests their head on the table, finally surrendering to sleep, another will quietly drape a wool coat over their back. They are a family forged in the crucible of silence. The heaviest burden they carry, however, is not the secrecy or the fatigue. It is the terrible, agonizing knowledge of what the numbers mean. Because sometimes, amidst the endless days of frustration, a pattern emerges. A mathematical wall crumbles. A word is deciphered. And then another. And suddenly, the gibberish on the page transforms into a terrifying truth. The moment of discovery is rarely marked by a shout of triumph. It is usually just a quiet gasp, a sudden stillness in the room as a tired man slowly pushes his chair back from the desk. He looks down at a scrap of paper, his heart hammering in his chest. The decoded message speaks of ships moving. It speaks of fuel loads, of flight paths, of a grand fleet gathering in the shadows. It speaks of a destination, the Coral Sea. In that fleeting moment, the codebreakers see the future. They see the phantom ships forming on their charts, creeping inexorably toward the unsuspecting young men we left on the sunlit decks. They know a storm is coming, and they know exactly where the lightning will strike. Imagine the feeling of holding that piece of paper. You are sitting in a safe, quiet room, perhaps thousands of miles away from the ocean, yet you hold the lives of thousands of boys in your hand. You can see the danger approaching them in the dark, but you cannot reach out and pull them away. You cannot yell a warning across the water. You can only work faster. The pace in the dungeon quickens, but the silence remains. The quiet desperation deepens. They skip meals. They refuse to sleep. They pore over every intercept, trying to glean just one more detail, one more scrap of information that might give their boys an advantage. They are trying to weave a protective blanket out of numbers and send it across the world. They think of the sailors on the water. Though they have never met them, the codebreakers feel a profound, parental devotion to the men in the fleet. They know the names of the ships. They know the schedules. In their minds, those great gray vessels are not machines of war, they are fragile homes filled with precious lives. The thought of those ships burning, of those young boys being swallowed by the deep blue water, is a nightmare that haunts the codebreakers' brief, restless hours of sleep. And so, they translate the warning. They type out a message, clean and clear, stripping away the mystery and leaving only the stark, frightening truth. The enemy is coming. They are heading south. They will be in the Coral Sea. The message is handed to a runner, who disappears through the heavy steel doors, carrying the secret up into the light, where it will be transmitted across the ocean to the waiting admirals. Down in the basement, there is no celebration. The warning has been sent, but the anxiety does not lift. If anything, the waiting becomes harder. They have set the pieces on the board, but they cannot control the game. They must sit in their windowless rooms, surrounded by the hum of the fans, and wait for the airwaves to tell them what happens next. A young man takes a slow, deep breath, rubbing the heel of his hand against his tired eyes. He reaches for his cold coffee, takes a sip, and pulls a fresh, blank sheet of paper toward him. He adjusts the heavy black headphones, leaning closer to the typewriter. He closes his eyes and listens to the static, waiting for the whispers in the wires to begin again, hoping against hope that the warning arrived in time, and praying for the boys who are sailing unknowingly into the shadow of the storm. There is a special kind of silence that falls when a heavy rope slips from its mooring and a ship surrenders to the tide. Under the deep, velvet blanket of a moonless night, the great harbors of the Pacific begin to empty. There are no cheering crowds lining the docks, no brass bands playing triumphant marches, no flutter of bright paper confetti catching the wind. The departure of these massive steel islands is a secret kept by the dark. They move like phantoms, slipping away from the safety of the land while the rest of the world is fast asleep. On the shore, the coastal towns and island outposts are quiet. The windows of the houses are dark, their inhabitants wrapped in warm blankets, dreaming of ordinary things. A dog barks in the distance, a lonely sound that echoes across the water. For the sailors standing on the cold metal of the weather decks, watching the dim, scattered lights of the coastline slowly retreat, the contrast is a heavy thing to carry. They are leaving behind the world of soft earth, of growing things, of quiet streets and warm hearths. They are crossing the threshold into a place where the ground beneath their feet will constantly shift, and where the horizon offers no shelter. The ships themselves are marvels of iron and ambition, floating cities that have severed their tethers to the world. Because they are sailing into contested waters, they run completely blacked out. Not a single light is allowed to shine from a porthole or an open hatch. From a distance, they are simply immense shadows gliding over the water, darker shapes moving against a dark sky. The only proof of their passing is the soft, rhythmic churning of the water at the bow, and the pale, ghostly ribbon of phosphorescence trailing in their wake. Inside the hulls, a different kind of life continues its steady, comforting hum. The air is warm, smelling faintly of baked bread from the galleys and the ever-present scent of machine oil. In the dimly lit passageways, illuminated only by the soft red glow of battle lanterns, men move quietly. They speak in hushed voices, out of a subconscious respect for the sleeping ocean outside their steel walls. The vibration of the engines is a constant companion, a deep, resonant purr that travels through the soles of their shoes and settles in their bones. It is the heartbeat of the ship, a reassuring promise that they are moving, that they are alive. Deep within the belly of these giant vessels lies the hangar deck, a vast, cavernous room that feels like a sleeping cathedral of metal. Here, resting in the shadows, are the airplanes. With their wings folded back, they look like enormous, resting birds, huddled together for warmth in the drafty air. This is the domain of the mechanics, the quiet, grease-stained caretakers of the fleet. These men are older, or at least they seem older in their eyes. They carry a quiet, serious devotion to their work. In the quiet hours of the night shift, under the beam of a single, shielded flashlight, you can find them moving around the aircraft with a tenderness that is almost heartbreaking. They wipe a smudge of oil from a cowling with a soft rag. They check a tightening bolt one last time. They pat the cold aluminum of a fuselage with an affection they might show to a loyal horse. The mechanics know the boys who fly these machines. They have shared jokes with them, poured them cups of terrible, scalding coffee, and watched them try to hide their trembling hands before a flight. The mechanics feel a profound, silent responsibility. When they tighten a wire or clean a spark plug, it is not just maintenance, it is a prayer. It is an unspoken promise to the young aviator, I have made this machine as perfect as human hands can make it. It will hold together for you. Just promise me you will fly it well, and bring it back. And what of those young aviators? Up in the cramped, narrow berthing compartments, the boys who ride these machines into the sky are trying to sleep. They are so young, many of them barely men, with fresh faces and eyes that still hold the remnants of childhood dreams. During the day, they wear a mask of easy bravado. They lean against the bulkheads in their worn leather flight jackets, laughing loudly, playing cards, and talking about the girls they left behind. They pretend that they are invincible, that the sky is just a playground, and that danger is something that only happens to other people. But the night strips away the bravado. When the lights are turned low, and the only sound is the creaking of the ship and the breathing of the men around them, the masks fall away. Lying in their narrow bunks, staring up at the springs of the mattress above them, they are visited by their private, quiet fears. They do not fear the enemy as a concept. They fear the vastness of the ocean. They fear the blinding white fog that can swallow a plane whole. They fear the terrifying prospect of flying for hours over an endless blue mirror, running low on fuel, and realizing that their floating iron home is nowhere to be seen. The ocean is so impossibly large, and they are so very small. To push the fear away, they write. Sitting cross-legged on their blankets, balancing a small notepad on their knees, they uncap their fountain pens. They write to their mothers, their fathers, their sweethearts. The letters are not filled with tales of courage or descriptions of the ship. They write about memories. They recall the smell of pine trees in the winter, the taste of homemade pie, the sound of rain on a tin roof. They write to anchor themselves to the earth. Sometimes, a young pilot will hold a letter he has just received, bringing the thin paper up to his face, closing his eyes, and trying to breathe in the faint, lingering scent of home. It is a fragile tether, a string of words stretched across thousands of miles of salt water, holding him steady in the dark. When sleep refuses to come, a restless aviator might quietly slip out of his bunk, pull a heavy sweater over his shoulders, and make his way up through the labyrinth of the ship to the flight deck. Stepping out onto the flight deck at night is like stepping off the edge of the world. The wind immediately catches his hair, cold and smelling deeply of salt. The darkness is absolute. There is no horizon, no line where the water ends and the sky begins. There is only a sweeping, infinite dome of black, dusted with a staggering, breathtaking spray of stars. Without the light pollution of the cities, the stars over the open Pacific are violently bright. They do not just twinkle, they burn. The Milky Way is a thick, luminous cloud of silver dust curving across the heavens. The young aviator walks to the edge of the deck, resting his hands on the cold steel railing, leaning out over the invisible, rushing water below. He looks up, searching the sky for something familiar. He finds Orion. He finds the Big Dipper. He traces the constellations with his eyes, remembering how he used to look at these exact same stars from the porch of his childhood home. He remembers the squeak of the porch swing, the warm summer breeze rustling the leaves of the oak tree in the front yard. For a fleeting, beautiful moment, the distance vanishes. The stars are the same. The sky is the same. He is connected, in this quiet, cosmic geometry, to the people he loves. If they were to walk outside right now and look up, they would be sharing the same light. But then, the ship pitches gently in a long ocean swell, and the spell is broken. The oak tree fades. The porch swing is gone. He is brought back to the reality of the cold wind and the vibrating steel beneath his boots. He looks up at the stars one last time, a quiet question blooming in his heart. Will I ever see you from the solid ground of home again? He does not ask it with panic. He asks it with a profound, quiet acceptance of the path he has chosen. He takes a deep breath of the ocean air, filling his lungs with the cold, clean night, and turns back toward the heavy steel hatch. He steps back into the warm, dimly lit passageways of the ship, returning to his bunk, to his friends, to the waiting morning. As the night deepens, the fleets drift further into the embrace of the Pacific. They are a gathering of iron and dreams, thousands of men suspended in a delicate bubble of air and metal, floating over a fathomless deep. They belong neither to the sky nor to the earth, but to the quiet, rolling rhythm of the sea. The ships sail on, leaving the safety of the known world far behind them. The water parts gently at their bows, murmuring a soft, endless song against the hulls. It is a peaceful, gentle journey through the dark, carrying the young men, their letters, their fears, and their quiet resilience ever closer to the horizon, where the sun waits patiently to rise. There is a profound and heavy silence that settles over the earth when the heat of the day reaches its peak, a quiet so deep you can almost hear the pulse of the resting world. Far from the cool, gray steel of the fleets slowly navigating the open waters, there is a place where the ocean finally meets the land. It is not a grand, sprawling metropolis or a fortress of concrete and stone. It is a sleepy, sun-baked outpost on the very edge of the world, a small town resting precariously between the towering, ancient jungles of New Guinea and the vast, shimmering expanse of the Coral Sea. This is Port Moresby. To the men in quiet rooms thousands of miles away, staring at maps laid out on long wooden tables, it is a vital prize. It is a stepping stone, a linchpin, a place that must be taken or must be held. But to the young soldiers who are actually there, sitting in the thick, unmoving air of the tropics, it is simply a place of overwhelming heat and endless waiting. To understand their world, you must imagine the heat. It is not the familiar, dry warmth of a summer afternoon back home. It is a heavy, living thing. The air is so thick with humidity that simply drawing a breath feels like drinking warm water. The sun does not just shine, it presses down upon the earth, bleaching the tin roofs of the small buildings and baking the dirt roads into a fine, powdery red dust that coats everything. It dusts their boots, their skin, the leaves of the palm trees, and the rims of their tin cups. It is a place where the vibrant, almost aggressive green of the jungle threatens to swallow the small scratches of civilization the moment the men turn their backs. The boys who have been sent to guard this outpost are strangers in a strange land. They grew up walking on paved sidewalks beneath street lamps, or running through fields of golden wheat that swayed in cool autumn breezes. They know the smell of pine needles, of wood smoke, of frost on a window pane. Now, they find themselves in a world that feels entirely alien, a vibrant, chaotic painting of towering ferns, brilliantly colored birds that screech in the canopy, and insects that buzz with a loud, rhythmic intensity that never truly stops. In the middle of the day, when the sun is directly overhead, the world simply stops moving. The heat demands surrender. The local inhabitants, who know the ancient rhythms of this land, retreat to the shade, resting until the fierce glare of the sun begins to soften. And the young soldiers, dripping with sweat, their uniforms clinging to their tired shoulders, learn to do the same. They find whatever shade they can, under the broad, waxy leaves of a banyan tree, or beneath the slanting shadow of a canvas tent. They sit with their helmets off, wiping their brows with damp handkerchiefs, staring out at the harbor. The hardest part of their days is not the physical labor, though digging trenches and moving supplies in the sweltering heat is an exhausting trial. The hardest part is the waiting. They know, in a quiet, unspoken way, that the war is slowly turning its vast and terrible eye toward their small patch of dirt. They can feel the tide of history creeping toward their shores, as inevitable as the ocean tide that laps against the wooden pylons of the docks. Yet, when they look out over the waters of the Coral Sea, it is breathtakingly beautiful and entirely empty. The water is a brilliant, mesmerizing sapphire, glittering with a million tiny reflections of the sun. It looks like a paradise, a place meant for sailing small wooden boats and swimming in the gentle shallows. It is almost impossible to reconcile the beauty of the horizon with the danger they know is lurking just beyond it. So, they wait. And in the waiting, their minds drift back across the thousands of miles of ocean to the places they left behind. In the late afternoon, as the shadows finally begin to lengthen and a faint, blessed breeze stirs the tops of the palm trees, the camp becomes quiet in a different way. It is the hour of letters. A young soldier sits on an overturned wooden crate, using his knees as a desk. He carefully unfurls a piece of paper, trying not to smudge the ink with the sweat from his hands. He wants to write to his mother, but he struggles to find the words to describe this place. How can he explain the sheer size of the jungle leaves, or the way the rain doesn't just fall, but violently empties from the sky in a blinding, deafening sheet? He decides not to write about the heat, or the mosquitoes, or the deep, aching homesickness that settles in his chest when the sun goes down. He protects her from his discomfort. Instead, he writes about the colors. He tells her about a parrot he saw, painted in impossible shades of crimson and blue. He tells her about the strange, sweet fruit the local children shared with him. He writes, "Do not worry about me. The ocean here is very beautiful, and I am safe. I hope the roses in the front yard have bloomed. I miss the sound of the screen door closing. He folds the letter carefully, a fragile piece of his heart, and places it with the others, hoping the mail plane will come soon. These small acts of writing are lifelines, a way to prove to themselves that the world they remember still exists, that there is more to life than the red dust and the waiting. As the sun begins its descent, it paints the sky over Port Moresby in a display of colors so vivid they seem almost imaginary. The horizon ignites in brilliant streaks of violet, bruised orange, and a deep, fiery gold. For a few brief moments, the entire camp stops to watch. Two soldiers, standing near a perimeter fence, lean against the wooden posts. One offers the other a cigarette. They light it, cupping their hands around the small flame, and pass it back and forth in silence. They don't need to speak. They share the same weariness, the same quiet anxiety, and the same awe at the beauty of the dying day. In this profound isolation, they have become brothers, bound together not by grand ideals, but by the shared reality of warm drinking water, red dust, and the empty, waiting sea. When night finally falls, it brings a small measure of relief from the heat, but the darkness introduces a new kind of heavy silence. The jungle seems to lean closer to the camp, filled with the rustle of unseen things moving through the underbrush. The outpost is blacked out, no fires allowed, no lanterns to pierce the gloom. The soldiers sit in the dark, listening. They listen to the rhythmic, eternal sound of the waves washing against the shore. They listen to the wind moving through the tall grass. And they listen for the deep, low drone of engines in the sky, or the distant, muffled rumble of a ship's guns. Every shadow on the water plays tricks on their tired eyes. Is that a cloud blocking the stars, or is it the silhouette of a steel giant slipping into their harbor? They are the gatekeepers at the edge of the world, guarding a sleepy, sweltering town that never asked to be part of a grand game. They are just boys, missing their beds, their families, and the cool touch of a familiar breeze. As they settle down to sleep on their narrow cots, wrapped in mosquito netting that feels like a fragile cocoon against the vastness of the tropical night, they close their eyes and listen to the gentle breathing of the ocean. The outpost of Port Moresby slumbers under a blanket of stars, peaceful and quiet for one more night, holding its breath in the humid dark as the silent, creeping tide of history draws ever closer to its shores. Even the most hidden corners of the earth cannot sleep forever when the world decides to wake. There is an island named Tulagi, a delicate crescent of emerald green resting in the deep, warm embrace of the Pacific. Before the heavy hands of history reached its shores, it was a place wrapped in an almost sacred quiet. The mornings that did not begin with the sharp ringing of bells or the clatter of city streets. They began with a soft, peach-colored light bleeding over the horizon, painting the clouds in bruised purples and brilliant golds. The dawn arrived slowly, heralded only by the gentle, rhythmic sighing of the tide against the coral reefs, and the quiet rustle of palm fronds waking in the morning breeze. For the men stationed on this lonely outpost, the war had felt like a ghost story told in another room. They were so far from the great cities, so far from the sweeping movements of fleets and armies, that the island felt like a sanctuary floating out of time. They lived in a state of suspended animation, surrounded by a beauty so vast and indifferent it almost made them forget why they were wearing uniforms in the first place. Imagine the absolute stillness of that final, peaceful morning. The air is already growing warm, thick with the sweet, heavy scent of tropical flowers and damp earth. Outside a small wooden barracks, a young man sits on a makeshift bench, his boots unlaced, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. In his hands, he cradles a tin cup of coffee. The metal is hot against his palms, a comforting, grounding sensation. He is watching the mist slowly burn off the surface of the water, revealing a sea that looks like a flawless sheet of hammered blue glass. A few feet away, another boy is carefully folding a letter he wrote the night before. His fingers are clumsy, thick with sleep, but he treats the thin paper as if it were spun gold. He has spent 3 pages trying to describe the peculiar shade of the ocean to his wife back home, finally settling on the color of the velvet ribbon she used to wear in her hair. He places the folded square into an envelope, tracing her name with his thumb, smiling a quiet, private smile. They are surrounded by the simple, beautiful mundane. Someone is humming a song from a scratchy radio broadcast they heard months ago. Another is meticulously polishing a pair of boots, the rhythmic swish of the brush blending with the sound of the waves. It is a moment of profound, human ordinary, fragile as a soap bubble resting on a blade of grass. And then, the quiet begins to fray. It does not happen all at once. It starts as a feeling, a subtle shift in the air pressure, a strange, low vibration that seems to come from the water itself. The young man on the bench stops mid-sip, lowering his tin cup. The humming stops. The boy with the envelope looks up from his hands, turning his face toward the sky. The birds, which had been calling to one another in the lush green canopy, suddenly fall completely silent. The island holds its breath. From far away, over the rim of the horizon, a sound drifts in on the wind. It is a low, mechanical drone, like the angry buzzing of a distant hive. For a few, confusing seconds, the men simply stare at the sky, their minds refusing to bridge the gap between this quiet paradise and the reality of what that sound means. Perhaps it is a flock of strange birds. Perhaps it is a trick of the wind. Perhaps it is a supply plane, coming early. But the drone grows louder, deeper, pressing against their eardrums until the vibration rattles the very floorboards beneath their feet. And then, slipping out from the soft white clouds, they see them. Silver shapes, moving with terrifying grace and speed, drawing dark lines across the pristine blue sky. The illusion of safety shatters like a dropped mirror. There is no malice in the sky, only the cold, inevitable machinery of a world that has lost its way. The ocean, which had seemed so impossibly vast, so endlessly wide that it could surely protect them from anything, suddenly feels terribly, frighteningly small. The protective moat has dried up. The world has found them. The next few minutes are not a blur of dramatic heroics, but a surreal, fragmented dream of sudden movement and profound confusion. The air is torn apart by the roar of engines diving toward the shallows. Shapes detach from the silver plains, falling like heavy raindrops toward the mirror of the bay. When the first impacts hit the water, the ocean erupts. Great, towering plumes of white water and seafoam bloom into the air, reaching toward the sky like desperate hands. The noise is a physical weight, pressing the breath from the men's lungs. The ground shudders, violently rejecting the peaceful morning. The boy drops his coffee cup. It clatters against the wood, the dark liquid spilling unnoticed across the floorboards. The men run. They do not run with the coordinated precision of soldiers in a drill, they run with the clumsy, terrifying urgency of human beings trying to escape a suddenly angry sky. They scramble into the dense underbrush, throwing themselves down into the damp, forgiving earth, burying their faces in the roots of the ancient trees. Down in the dirt, the world shrinks to the space of a few inches. The smell of crushed ferns and pulverized coral fills their noses. They squeeze their eyes shut, pulling their helmets down, trying to make themselves as small as possible. The ground bucks beneath them, a terrifying reminder that nowhere is truly solid. In the midst of this overwhelming noise and tearing of the earth, there are small, quiet moments that history will never record, but that mean everything in the dark. A young sailor, trembling so violently he cannot catch his breath, feels a heavy, calloused hand pressed down firmly on his shoulder. He opens his eyes, peering through the dust, to see an older man lying next to him. The older man's face is covered in a fine layer of white coral dust, but his eyes are completely calm. He doesn't say a word, the roar around them would drown it out anyway. He just gives the young sailor's shoulder a steady, reassuring squeeze. "I am here," that touch says. "You are not alone in the dark." It is a tiny, invisible act of heroism, a tether holding a terrified boy to the earth when the sky is falling. Nearby, a man realizes he has dropped his letter in the frantic dash for the trees. For a brief, irrational second, he thinks about going back for it. He pictures the white envelope sitting in the dirt, the wind threatening to carry it away into the bay. It is his connection to the world before, to the quiet porch and the velvet ribbon. But another explosion shakes the leaves above him, showering him in dirt, and he presses his face back into his arms, weeping quietly not from pain, but from the sudden, profound loss of the peace he had taken for granted just moments before. Out in the shallows, the floating metal giants that had been anchored so peacefully are surrounded by geysers of white water. The ripples spread outward, violently disturbing the ancient coral reefs, sending schools of brightly colored fish darting into the deep shadows. The war has touched the water, staining the pristine blue with the dark, oily tears of broken machines. And then, almost as quickly as it began, the terrible storm passes. The silver shapes climb back into the clouds, the roar of their engines fading away until it is nothing more than a hum, and then, a memory. The island is left in a stunning, ringing silence. The dust slowly begins to settle, drifting down through the sunlight like snow. The men stay in the dirt a little longer, their hearts hammering against their ribs like trapped birds. They wait for the sky to fall again, but the sky remains empty. Slowly, hesitantly, they begin to rise. They brush the dirt from their knees, coughing in the dusty air. They look at one another, their faces pale, their eyes wide with the shared realization of what has just happened. The sanctuary is gone. They check on each other with quiet, breathless questions. Are you hurt? Are you okay? They reach out, pulling friends to their feet, brushing the debris from each other's shoulders with trembling hands. They walk back to the shoreline and look out over the bay. The water is no longer a perfect mirror. It is churning, unsettled, marked by the swirling debris of the morning's chaos. The ripples in the shallows are still bouncing against the shoreline, a physical reminder of the violent intrusion. The men look out at the horizon, the place where the sky meets the sea. Just an hour ago, it was a beautiful, empty canvas. Now, it is a door that has been kicked open. They realize that the ocean is not a wall keeping the rest of the world away, it is a road, and someone is traveling on it. The island of Tulagi will never be the same. The quiet has been permanently broken, replaced by a lingering, heavy anticipation. As the men gather their scattered belongings, picking up a dropped tin cup, wiping the dirt from a crumpled envelope, they know that this was merely the first breath of the storm. They sit by the water, listening to the waves trying to find their gentle rhythm once again. They look at the sky, no longer trusting the clouds, and they wait. The immense, lonely ocean has suddenly become very small, and the ripples of what has started here are already spreading outward, carrying the heavy machinery of war deep into the heart of the Coral Sea. There is a profound and gentle terror in a world that simply erases itself, leaving you entirely alone in a sky made of milk and shadows. The warm, sunlit expanse of the Pacific, with its dazzling blues and welcoming breezes, is not a constant friend. As the fleets drift deeper into the Coral Sea, the weather begins to quietly turn, as if the ocean itself is trying to draw a veil over the ambitions of men. The sky softens, losing its brilliant azure edge, bleeding slowly into a pale, bruised violet, and finally into a sprawling, featureless gray. Heavy rain squalls, born from the humid breath of the tropics, rise up from the water like towering pillars of slate. They move across the surface with a slow, sweeping grace, dragging curtains of blinding, silver mist behind them. The great steel islands, which had seemed so invincible and massive just days before, are suddenly swallowed whole. They become phantoms, drifting silently through a white void. The horizon, that comforting line that separates the heavens from the earth, simply vanishes. There is no up, and there is no down. There is only the damp, enveloping fog. To stand on the deck of a ship in this mist is to feel the immense, crushing isolation of the sea. The air is heavy and cold, thick with a fine drizzle that settles into the rough wool of the sailors' coats and gathers in shining droplets on their eyelashes. The familiar sounds of the ship are muted, pressed down by the heavy atmosphere. The rhythmic churning of the wake is swallowed by the fog, and even the deep, thrumming heartbeat of the engine seems to be muffled, turned into a distant, underwater vibration. The lookouts stand high in the swaying superstructures, leaning out into the wind, their eyes straining until they ache. They are searching for the enemy, but they cannot even see the escort ships sailing just a few hundred yards away. They are a fleet of ghosts, blind and stumbling, playing a slow, quiet game of hide-and-seek in an ocean that has lost all its borders. Every shadow in the mist looks like a monster. Every sudden gust of wind sounds like the roar of an approaching engine. The waiting becomes a physical weight, settling deep in their chests. Yet, despite the blindness of the world, the heavy machinery of the fleet must continue its steady turning. The flight decks, slick with rain and slicker with spilled oil, become stages for a quiet, desperate ballet. The young aviators, wrapped in heavy leather jackets and thick scarves, climb into the cockpits of their machines. They look at the mechanics who help them strap in, sharing brief, silent nods. There are no smiles today. The bravado of the sunlit mornings is gone, replaced by a solemn, tight-lipped focus. When the signal is given, the engines roar to life, a sudden, violent tearing of the quiet mist. But as soon as the wheels leave the wooden deck, as soon as the aircraft clears the bow of the ship, the sound is swallowed by the gray. In an instant, the ship is gone. The ocean is gone. The young pilot finds himself suspended in a pale, glowing nothingness. Imagine what it feels like to fly inside a cloud. It is not like flying through the air, it is like swimming through milk. The light is diffused, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once, creating a strange, pearlescent glow that offers no shadows and no depth. The moisture in the air immediately freezes against the glass of the canopy, a creeping frost that seals the pilot inside a tiny, vibrating capsule of aluminum and canvas. Inside this capsule, the smell is a potent mixture of high-octane aviation fuel, hot engine oil, and the damp, earthy scent of wet wool. It is cold, a deep, penetrating chill that seeps through the layers of clothing and settles in the joints. The pilot grips the control stick with leather-gloved hands, his knuckles white, his entire body tense. Without the horizon to guide him, his senses begin to lie to him. The inner ear, confused by the lack of visual anchors, whispers that the plane is banking to the left, or perhaps plunging toward the invisible waves below. It takes a terrifying, exhausting amount of willpower to ignore his own body, to stare blindly straight ahead, and to trust the small, glowing dials on the instrument panel. These instruments become his entire universe. In the gloom of the cockpit, the radium paint on the dials glows with a soft, eerie green light, like captured fireflies. The compass needle floating in its liquid bath is the only tether connecting him to reality. He watches that needle with the devotion of a man praying for salvation. If he looks away for too long, if he lets his mind drift into the endless white stretching out beyond the glass, he might simply tumble out of the sky. But the isolation is the heaviest burden of all. The pilot is surrounded by infinity, a tiny speck of life moving through a cold, indifferent void. The creeping fear of being lost forever above the endless sea sits right beside him, a quiet, uninvited passenger. To push the fear away, he relies on the only human connection left to him. In the seat behind him, separated by a bulkhead of metal and wires, sits his radio man or gunner. They cannot see each other through the bulky gear and the frosted glass. They are two boys sharing the same metal shell, relying entirely on a thin, crackling wire to prove they are not alone. The pilot presses the button on his intercom. The radio hisses with the static of distant atmospheric storms, a sound like dry leaves blowing across pavement. "How are you holding up back there?" the pilot asks, his voice deliberately slow, deliberately calm, trying to hide the tremor in his chest. A second of static, and then the muffled, tinny voice of his friend returns. "Just fine up here. It's a bit drafty, though. Thinking about my mother's pot roast. How about you?" "I'm thinking about a hot cup of coffee," the pilot replies, a faint, weary smile touching his lips beneath his leather mask. "Keep your eyes peeled. Let me know if you see anything besides gray. You'll be the first to know." It is a remarkably mundane conversation, two young men discussing dinner and coffee while suspended thousands of feet in the air, flying blindly over an ocean that could swallow them without a trace. But that simple exchange is a lifeline. It is a reminder that there is a world beyond the mist, a world of kitchens, and warm fires, and people who know their names. They cling to the sound of each other's voices, building a tiny, fragile fortress of human warmth against the freezing void. As they fly onward, searching for an enemy they cannot see, the pilot's mind inevitably drifts backward, drawn by the invisible gravity of home. Tucked carefully into the breast pocket of his uniform, resting against his heartbeat, is a letter. It is damp with condensation now, the edges curling, but he knows every word written on it by heart. He remembers the handwriting, the elegant, sloping cursive of his younger sister. He remembers the porch swing where she probably sat to write it. He can almost hear the squeak of the chains, almost smell the blooming honeysuckle that climbed the trellis by the front door. He closes his eyes for just a fraction of a second, letting the memory wash over him. In his mind, he is not a warrior hunting in the mist. He is just a boy walking up the front steps, opening the screen door, and smelling wood smoke from the fireplace. These memories are his true compass. They are the fixed points of light in his soul that tell him who he is, and where he belongs, even when the world outside has lost all shape and meaning. The hours stretch out, measured only by the steady, terrifying drop of the needle on the fuel gauge. The hunt in the clouds is a surreal experience. They know the enemy fleets are out there somewhere, hidden in this exact same mist, flown by boys who are feeling the exact same fear, relying on their own glowing dials, thinking of their own quiet homes. There is a strange, melancholy intimacy to it. They are sharing the same blind terror, brothers in the fog, separated only by the painted symbols on their wings and the tragic circumstances of history. Eventually, the fuel gauge dictates that the hunt must end. The hardest part of the journey begins, the return. Turning the plane around in the white void is an act of blind faith. The pilot adjusts his heading, watching the green needle swing in its liquid bath, praying that his calculations are correct. The ocean is vast, and his ship is a tiny, moving sliver of wood and steel. If he misses it by even a few degrees, he will fly out into the empty Pacific until the engine simply stops, and the gray mist finally takes him. The silence in the cockpit deepens. The radio man stops talking about pot roast. The pilot wipes a fresh layer of frost from the inside of the canopy with the back of his heavy glove, peering down into the milk, desperate for a break in the clouds. The tension is a physical ache in his shoulders, a tightening in his throat. Every shadow looks like a ship. Every darkening of the mist plays tricks on his desperate eyes. He touches the pocket over his heart, feeling the damp paper of the letter inside. "Bring me home," he whispers to the empty sky. "Just bring me home." And then, a miracle. Through a momentary tear in the heavy mist, a color appears. It is a dark, bruised slate blue, the color of the ocean. The pilot banks the plane sharply, chasing the tear in the clouds, diving toward the water. As he drops beneath the lowest layer of the fog, the surface of the sea comes rushing up to meet him, a chaotic expanse of wind-whipped waves. He levels out, flying dangerously low, the salt spray misting against his windshield. He scans the horizon with frantic, burning eyes. There. A faint, churning scratch of bright white against the dark water. Awake. He follows the ribbon of white foam, his heart hammering against his ribs, until the massive, beautiful, ugly gray shape of the aircraft carrier materializes from the gloom. It is the most magnificent sight he has ever seen. It is an island of iron, a sanctuary of life in a world of water. The approach is terrifying. The deck is pitching heavily in the unseen ocean swells, rising and falling in the mist. The pilot wrestles with the control stick, fighting the unpredictable crosswinds, his breathing shallow and rapid. He cuts the throttle. The plane drops heavily. There is a violent, jarring thud as the rubber wheels strike the wet wooden deck. The aircraft bounces, slamming down again, before the tail hook catches the arresting wire with a violent, beautiful jerk that throws the pilot forward against his straps. The plane rolls to a sudden, absolute stop. For a long moment, the pilot does not move. He just sits there in the cockpit, listening to the engine sputter and die. The sudden absence of the roar is overwhelming. He slowly exhales, a long, shaky breath that seems to carry all the terror of the sky out of his lungs. He slides the canopy back. The cold, damp air of the sea rushes in, smelling of salt and diesel fumes. It is the smell of life. A mechanic climbs up onto the wing. The man's face is slick with rain, his heavy jacket soaked through. He doesn't ask how the flight was. He doesn't ask if they found the enemy. He simply looks at the pale, exhausted face of the young pilot, reaches into his large pocket, and pulls out a thick ceramic mug. "Here you go, kid," the mechanic says, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "It's terrible, but it's hot." The pilot takes the mug with trembling hands. The heat of the thick coffee radiates through his wet leather gloves, a tiny, glowing ember of comfort. He takes a slow sip, tasting the bitterness, feeling the warmth travel down into his shivering chest. He looks at the mechanic, offering a tired, silent nod of profound gratitude. Down on the flight deck, other planes are emerging from the mist, dropping out of the sky like exhausted birds returning to the nest. The men on the ship move quickly, securing the aircraft, tying them down against the rocking of the sea. The fleets remain hidden from one another, separated by miles of gray ocean and heavy clouds. The ghosts in the coral mists have returned to their floating homes, retreating into the damp shadows. The battle remains unfought, suspended in the fog, waiting for the sky to clear. But for tonight, as the young pilot climbs down onto the solid, reassuring wood of the flight deck, clutching his hot coffee and the damp letter over his heart, the waiting is enough. He is safe. He is not lost in the deep. And in the quiet, gentle rhythm of the sleeping ship, he can finally close his eyes and rest. There is a fragile line between what the eyes see and what the tired heart fears, a line that easily washes away in the endless blue of the open sea. When you stare out at the ocean for days on end, a strange and quiet transformation begins to take place. The water stops being simply a surface and becomes a vast, hypnotic canvas. The coral sea, with its impossibly clear waters and brilliant, piercing sunlight, is a master of illusions. Under the heavy heat of the midday sun, the air just above the waves begins to shimmer and dance, bending the light into impossible shapes. It is a beautiful, mesmerizing trick of nature, but for the young men tasked with watching that horizon, it becomes a beautiful torment. The fleets have been hunting each other for what feels like an eternity. The sailors and aviators have been living in a state of suspended anticipation, their bodies strung tight, their minds humming with the quiet, electrical buzz of adrenaline that has nowhere to go. Sleep, when it comes, is shallow and fractured, filled with the ghostly sounds of the ship and the restless movement of the ocean. They are exhausted. It is a profound, bone-deep weariness that settles behind the eyes and makes the edges of the world grow soft and blurry. High above the wooden decks, up in the swaying metal cages of the crow's nests, the lookouts stand their lonely vigils. They are wrapped in canvas jackets against the wind, their faces burned by the wind and the glare. They press heavy binoculars to their faces for hours at a time, until the black rubber eye cups leave deep, red rings around their eyes. Their only job is to watch the empty blue and look for a flaw in the canvas. A speck of dust in the sky. A smudge of gray on the horizon. A sudden break in the whitecaps. But when the mind is starved of rest, and the eyes are flooded with nothing but shifting light and rolling water, the imagination begins to paint its own pictures. The tension of waiting pushes their exhausted minds to see phantoms dancing in the deep blue. A young sailor, barely 19, leans against the cold iron railing of his perch. The rhythmic, pendulum swing of the ship is slowly rocking him into a waking trance. He blinks heavily, trying to clear the salt spray from his lashes. He raises his glasses and scans the water. Suddenly, his breath catches in his throat. His heart gives a violent, sudden flutter against his ribs. There, just beneath the surface, a massive dark shadow is moving. It is sleek, silent, and terrifyingly large. A submarine. It has to be. He reaches a trembling hand toward the brass speaking tube to sound the alarm, to shatter the quiet afternoon with the terrifying clatter of bells. But he hesitates. He looks again, forcing his tired eyes to focus through the glare. As the ship draws closer, the water clears. The shadow shifts, breaking the surface with a gentle, majestic splash. It is not a machine of war. It is a whale, a gentle giant of the deep, exhaling a plume of mist into the warm air before slipping back down into the silent dark. The boy lowers his hand from the alarm. He lets out a long, shaky breath that is half a laugh and half a sob. He rubs a gloved hand over his face, feeling the grit of the salt on his skin. He is so tired. He just wants to lie down in the cool grass of his backyard, far away from this place where every shadow is a monster waiting to strike. This quiet drama plays out dozens of times across the scattered fleets. The ocean is playing tricks on them all. A low-hanging rain squall, dark and dense with tropical moisture, perfectly mimics the imposing silhouette of an enemy battleship. The men on the bridge watch it through their spyglasses, their hands gripping the wooden rails until their knuckles turn white, mapping out trajectories and preparing for a fiery end. But as the wind shifts, the battleship dissolves into nothing more than harmless mist and falling rain, leaving behind a collective, exhausted exhale that sweeps through the ship like a breeze. Up in the sky, the aviators are wrestling with their own mirages. Flying a plane over a featureless ocean is a lonely and disorienting task even on the best of days. But now, hunting for a ghost fleet that could be anywhere, the strain is almost unbearable. The young pilots sit in their vibrating cockpits, the roar of the engines a constant, deafening companion. They stare down at the water until the sun glares blindly off the surface, turning the ocean into a brilliant, unreadable mirror. They are desperate to find something, desperate to end the waiting. This desperation plays cruel tricks on their vision. A pilot spots a long, straight line of white water stretching across the blue. Awake! He feels the sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline. He signals his wingman, banking his plane sharply, diving toward the ocean, his hands tight on the controls, preparing to face the gathered armada. But as he drops lower, the image fractures. The wake is not from a ship. It is a trick of the tide, a strange ocean current pushing against a hidden coral reef resting just below the surface. The water is perfectly, agonizingly empty. He pulls back on the stick, his plane climbing back into the lonely sky. He leans his head back against the leather headrest and closes his eyes for just a fraction of a second, overwhelmed by the sheer, crushing weight of the emptiness. The sky is full of phantoms, and he is chasing them all. How do you hold on to your mind when the world itself seems to be lying to you? How do you stay grounded when the horizon is constantly shifting, turning empty waves into massive armadas? You reach out for the things that are real. Back on the ship, the young lookout in the crow's nest feels a gentle tap on his shoulder. He jumps, startled, but turns to find an older sailor, a man whose face is lined with years of sea salt and sun. The older man doesn't say anything at first. He just hands the boy a metal canteen. The water inside is lukewarm and tastes faintly of tin, but to the parched boy, it is the sweetest thing he has ever swallowed. "I's playing tricks on you, son," the older man asks, his voice a low, soothing rumble that cuts through the whistling of the wind. The boy nods, embarrassed, looking down at his boots. "I thought I saw. I don't know what I saw. Everything looks like something else." The older man smiles softly, a warm crinkle around his eyes. "That's just the sea talking to you. She likes to tell tall tales when the sun is high. You have to look past the shimmer." He leans against the rail beside the boy, looking out at the very same empty water. "Tell me about your home," he says quietly. "Tell me about something that doesn't move." And so, the boy talks. He talks about a small, dusty road in Texas. He talks about an old oak tree in his front yard that has stood in the exact same spot for 100 years. He talks about the porch swing that creaks in a familiar, comforting rhythm. As he speaks, the mirages on the water begin to lose their power. The phantoms fade. The terrifying shapes dissolve back into harmless swells and sea foam. The memory of home becomes his anchor, a heavy, solid thing that keeps his mind from drifting away on the tide. Down below decks, deep within the humming steel of the ship, other men are finding their own anchors. In the dim, red light of the berthing compartments, a sailor sits on his bunk, carefully unfolding a worn piece of paper. He has read this letter so many times that the creases are soft and fragile, threatening to tear. He doesn't need to read the words anymore, he knows them by heart. But he needs to hold the paper. He needs to run his thumb over the dried ink, to feel the physical indentation of the pen pressing into the page. His wife's hand made those marks. It is a piece of reality, a tangible proof that the world he loves is still there, waiting for him. The ocean may lie, the shadows may stretch and distort, but this piece of paper is true. He holds it to his chest, closes his eyes, and lets the steady, rhythmic vibration of the ship rock him. For a few precious moments, he is not on a warship hunting ghosts in the coral sea. He is sitting in his own kitchen, listening to the rain tap against the window pane. These small moments of connection, these quiet acts of grounding, are the true armor of the fleet. A shared cup of coffee. A hand on a shoulder. A conversation about a dog left behind or a sweetheart waiting on a train platform. They are simple things, ordinary things, but in a world made of mirages, the ordinary becomes incredibly powerful. It is the tether that keeps them human. As the long, exhausting day slowly begins to wane, the brutal glare of the sun softens. The sky shifts from blinding white to a gentle, bruised lavender, and then to a deep, cooling purple. With the fading of the light, the mirages finally lose their grip. The shadows stop dancing. The false ships melt back into the clouds. The ocean returns to being just an ocean, dark, vast, and quiet. The men on the watch breathe a collective sigh of relief as the night washes over them. The darkness is absolute, but it is an honest darkness. It doesn't trick the eyes. The stars emerge, pinpricks of icy white light that are fixed, reliable, and true. They are the same stars that shine over the dusty roads of Texas, over the quiet kitchens, over the oak trees and the porch swings. The sailors look up at the familiar constellations, letting the cool night air wash the heat and the tension from their faces. The phantoms of the deep blue have retreated, giving them a few hours of peace. They are still hunting, and they are still being hunted, but for tonight, the illusions have vanished. The sea slumbers, the ship hums its gentle lullaby, and the young men drift into a quiet, dreamless sleep, wrapped securely in the comforting dark. There is a special kind of heavy silence that falls over the heart when you look toward the horizon and realize that you are entirely, profoundly alone. While the swift and glamorous ships of the fleet raced ahead into the gathering storms, vanishing like silver ghosts into the distant mist, someone had to be left behind. Not every vessel is built for the breathless speed of the hunt. There are those that must travel at a humbler pace, carrying the heavy, quiet burdens that keep a fleet alive. Imagine a great, lumbering oil tanker, her belly deep and heavy with the thick, dark lifeblood of the Armada. She does not slice through the ocean with the elegant grace of a warship. Instead, she pushes the water aside with a slow, exhausted sigh, riding the long swells of the Pacific with the weary patience of an old workhorse. She is a floating warehouse of steel and rust, smelling constantly of crude oil, hot iron, and the salt of 1,000 days at sea. Beside this slow giant sails her only companion. It is a tiny escort ship, a nimble little guardian that dances in the massive wake of the tanker. Compared to the towering, black hull of the oiler, the escort looks impossibly fragile, like a small, loyal dog circling the feet of a gentle giant. They have been left behind in the vast expanse of the deep blue, told to wait in the empty waters, far from the anticipated clash of the great fleets. For the men aboard these two lonely ships, the war feels like a rumor whispered on another continent. The days stretch out in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The men on the tanker are not the dashing young aviators with silk scarves, nor are they the broad-shouldered gunners of the battleships. They are mechanics with grease permanently worked into the creases of their hands. They are cooks who bake bread in sweltering, windowless galleys. They are older men, some of them, who left behind quiet lives in dusty towns, seeking steady work and finding themselves adrift at the edge of the world. They sit on the warm, sun-baked decks in the late afternoons, watching the little escort ship cut its delicate white path through the water. There is a deep, unspoken affection between the two crews. They are bound together by their shared isolation. At night, when the ocean turns black and the stars press down from above, they speak to each other across the dark water using hooded, blinking signal lamps. A flash of light. A pause. Another flash. How is the watch? The little ship asks in the language of light. All is quiet. The coffee is still terrible, the giant replies. It is a small, glowing conversation in the middle of an infinite void, a reminder that they are not completely forgotten. The men stand by the railings, listening to the gentle hiss of the water parting against the hulls, and they let their minds wander home. A sailor on the little escort leans against a bulkhead, his eyes closed, listening to the hum of the deck. He is trying to remember the exact sound of his wife humming in the kitchen. He tries to picture the way the morning light catches the dust motes in his living room back in Ohio. In this quiet waiting room of the ocean, memories are the only things that feel entirely real. But the coral sea, with its shifting mists and blinding sun glare, is a place where illusions can prove fatal. The quiet peace of their vigil is shattered, not by malice, but by a tragic, terrible misunderstanding of shadows. High above the clouds, searching for the queens of the fleet, enemy aviators look down through a break in the mist. They see the wide, churning wake of the slow oiler, and in the confusing, shimmering haze of the ocean, they mistake her flat decks for something grander. They mistake her for a great prize. The attack does not come with a theatrical roar. For the men on the ships, it begins simply as a strange darkening of the sky, a high, thin whining sound that seems to vibrate behind their teeth. And then, the ocean simply tears itself apart. There is a surreal, muted horror to the moments that follow. It is not an intense battle, it is a sudden, overwhelming storm of violence raining down on a slow, defenseless target. Towering columns of white water erupt from the tranquil blue sea, rising higher than the ship's masts, raining cold, heavy salt water down onto the decks. The great oiler shudders, her thick steel plates groaning in agony as the water around her boils. And in that terrifying moment, the little escort ship, the tiny, loyal guardian, does not run. The boys on her decks do not turn away. With a quiet, heartbreaking devotion, the small ship throws itself into the chaos, firing its small guns into the overwhelming sky, trying to shield the lumbering giant behind it. It is a fleeting, desperate act of absolute love. The men on the little ship give everything they have, standing their ground in the churning water, until the ocean simply opens up and takes them. In a matter of moments, the protector is gone. The sea swallows the little ship whole, leaving behind nothing but a wreath of white bubbles, a slick of oil, and a profound, aching absence on the water. The giant is left entirely alone. Wounded, broken, and bleeding her dark oil into the pristine waters, the great tanker finally loses her strength. Deep in her belly, the heavy engines give a final, metallic shudder and go still. The rhythmic, thrumming heartbeat that the men had fallen asleep to for months simply stops. The silence that follows is the loudest sound the men have ever heard. The ship begins to tilt, leaning heavily into the water, a dying beast resting its head against the earth. But she does not sink. With a stubborn, quiet resilience, the crippled ship refuses to slip beneath the waves. She drifts, a sloping, ruined island of iron, utterly dead in the water, under a sky that has suddenly grown vast and indifferent once again. For the survivors, the world shrinks to the slanting, oil-slick deck beneath their boots. They are no longer sailors, they are castaways. They pull themselves up from the dark, flooded compartments, their faces stained black with thick crude oil, the whites of their eyes wide with shock and grief. They gather together on the highest point of the tilting deck, a huddle of shivering, exhausted humanity in the center of an empty sea. The tropical sun, which had once felt like a warm blanket, now becomes a punishing weight. It beats down on the slanted steel, turning the deck into a frying pan. The men have almost nothing. The ship's stores are flooded, swallowed by the dark water below. They are surrounded by an endless ocean of water, yet their throats are parched, burning with a thirst that makes it hard to swallow. In this desperate, quiet struggle for survival, the true nature of these men reveals itself. There is no panic. There is no shouting. There is only a profound, heartbreaking gentleness. A young mechanic, whose hands are badly burned, sits leaning against a twisted piece of metal railing. An older cook, his white apron ruined and soaked with seawater, crawls slowly up the slanting deck to sit beside him. The cook reaches into his pocket and pulls out a small, dented tin cup. It holds only a few swallows of warm, muddy rainwater they manage to catch in a canvas tarp. The cook does not drink it. He holds it to the young mechanic's cracked lips, steadying the boy's trembling head with a gentle hand. "Just a sip, son," the cook whispers, his voice dry and raspy. "Just a little sip. Let it rest on your tongue." The boy drinks, closing his eyes, a single tear cutting a clean line through the black oil on his cheek. It is a small, quiet act of everyday heroism, a moment of profound grace amidst the ruins. As the long, agonizing day slowly bleeds into evening, the heat lifts, replaced by a deep, penetrating chill. The wind picks up, whistling through the jagged holes in the ship's superstructure. The men huddle closer together, sharing their body heat, wrapping themselves in whatever damp scraps of canvas or ruined clothing they can find. They lie against the cold steel, staring up as the stars begin to emerge. The night sky is violently beautiful, a sprawling canvas of diamond dust that looks exactly the way it did when they were safe. The stars do not care that their ship is broken. The ocean does not care that they are alone. The universe is terrifyingly indifferent to their suffering. To fight the darkness, they whisper. They do not talk about the attack. They do not talk about the little ship that is gone, though its absence hangs over them like a heavy shroud. They talk about home. "My sister plays the piano," a voice whispers in the dark, barely louder than the wind. "She plays on Sunday evenings. You can hear it from the front porch. It sounds like falling rain." "I have a dog," another voice answers from the huddle. "A golden retriever. He sleeps at the foot of the bed. He's probably waiting by the door right now." They pass these memories back and forth in the dark like precious coins, buying themselves another hour of sanity, another hour of hope. A sailor reaches into his soaked jacket and touches a lump of wet paper. It is a letter from his mother. The ink is surely washed away, the words dissolved into a meaningless blur, but he presses his hand against it anyway. He knows what it says. He knows that he is loved, and in this vast, empty blue, that love is the only compass he has left. They are suspended between the ocean and the sky, enduring a lonely vigil that stretches on for days. The ship groans beneath them, shifting in the currents, threatening to finally let go and slip into the deep. Every time the metal creaks, the men hold their breath, waiting for the end. But the old ship holds on, cradling her boys, refusing to surrender them to the water. They wait. They watch the empty horizon until their eyes burn. They share drops of water and whispered memories of piano music and front porches. Their quiet, desperate struggle is no longer about fighting an enemy. It is a battle against the vastness, a haunting testament to human endurance, and a beautiful, tragic display of devotion in the face of absolute abandonment. They hold onto each other in the dark, trusting that somewhere, out beyond the edge of the world, someone is looking for them. There is a fleeting, fragile moment just before a storm breaks, when the world holds its breath and the sky seems to weep with the heavy weight of what is to come. The morning breaks over the coral sea with a deceptive, heartbreaking tenderness. As the sun begins its slow climb over the edge of the world, it paints the scattered clouds in soft, pastel shades of peach, lavender, and a delicate, dusty rose. The ocean is a sprawling mirror of deep, quiet indigo, moving only with the gentle, rhythmic breathing of the ancient tides. It is the kind of morning that makes a young man forget, if only for a few precious minutes, the heavy uniform he wears and the vast distances that separate him from the people he loves. On the flat, sweeping wooden deck of a proud and graceful aircraft carrier, the early hours are filled with the quiet, mundane choreography of life at sea. Young men, their faces still soft with the lingering traces of sleep, move about their duties in the cool, salty air. There is the rhythmic swish of brooms against the wood, the soft clatter of tin cups from the galley, and the low, murmuring hum of quiet conversations. They speak of the dreams they had the night before, of the sweet taste of fresh fruit, and of the letters they hope the next mail delivery will bring. To these boys, this great ship is more than just a vessel of war. It is their entire universe. It is a mountain of iron and steel, a floating city that feels as solid and permanent as the earth they left behind months ago. Down in the cavernous, humming belly of the ship, they have carved out tiny, personal spaces. They have taped faded photographs of smiling girls and proud parents to the cold metal bulkheads. They have tucked carefully folded sweaters and small, hand-stitched charms into their narrow lockers. The ship is their sanctuary, their guardian, a massive, unyielding fortress that protects them from the fathomless depths of the ocean below. But out here, in the vast and lonely blue, the concept of a sanctuary is a beautiful, fragile illusion. It begins not with a shout, but with a feeling. It is a subtle, vibrating shift in the air pressure, a strange tickle in the back of the throat. A young mechanic, his hands stained with the dark oil of the machines he lovingly tends, pauses in his work. He wipes his brow with the back of his wrist and looks up, shielding his eyes from the rising sun. At first, the sound is just a low, distant whisper, like the gentle humming of bees in a summer orchard. But the whisper grows. It deepens into a steady, mechanical thrum that seems to emanate from the very clouds themselves. The sweeping brooms stop. The tin cups are lowered. The boys on the deck turn their faces to the heavens, their breath catching in their chests. From out of the blinding morning sun, the silver shapes appear. They are beautiful and terrifying all at once, catching the light like falling leaves of metal, drifting down through the serene blue sky. There is a moment of profound, surreal stillness. Time seems to stretch and pull, slowing to a quiet crawl. The young men watch the sky with wide, unblinking eyes. In that fraction of a heartbeat, before the world changes forever, a boy remembers the exact smell of his mother's kitchen on a Sunday morning. Another thinks of the way the wind rustles the tall grass in the fields behind his childhood home. They hold these memories close to their hearts, an invisible shield against the falling sky. And then, the quiet morning shatters. The air fills with a sudden, deafening roar as the first true blow of the battle is struck. It is not just a sound, it is a physical force that punches the breath from their lungs and rattles the teeth in their jaws. The serene, indigo waters around the great ship erupt in towering geysers of white foam and blinding spray. The ocean, so peaceful just moments before, is suddenly torn open. When the great ship is struck, she does not merely shake. She groans. It is a deep, agonizing, metallic cry that reverberates through every steel beam and wooden plank. To the boys standing on her decks, it feels as though the very earth has betrayed them. The solid mountain of iron suddenly feels as thin and delicate as an eggshell. Fire blooms on the water, sudden and fiercely bright, painting the serene morning in harsh, unnatural colors. Thick, dark columns of smoke begin to rise, spiraling upward like bruised ribbons, smudging the perfect, pastel canvas of the sky. Beneath the smoke, in the dimly lit, labyrinthine corridors of the ship's interior, the true fragility of their sanctuary is realized. The ever-present, comforting hum of the engines, the heartbeat of the ship, suddenly stutters, coughs, and dies. The lights flicker and fade, plunging the narrow hallways into a terrifying, unfamiliar twilight. In this sudden dark, the true measure of a human heart is revealed. There is fear, yes, a deep and primal terror of the rushing water and the groaning metal. But cutting through that fear are small, quiet moments of incredible, heartbreaking grace. A young sailor, disoriented by the smoke and the sudden tilt of the floor beneath his boots, feels a strong hand grip his shoulder. It is an older petty officer, a man who has sailed these waters for years. The older man does not yell. He does not panic. He simply guides the boy's trembling hand to the railing. "This way, son," he whispers, his voice a steady, calming anchor in the chaos. "Just keep moving toward the light. I am right behind you." In the berthing compartments, the water is already beginning to seep across the linoleum floors. Boys are forced to make quiet, devastating choices in the span of seconds. They reach into their lockers, their fingers brushing against the heavy wool of their favorite sweaters, the books they haven't finished reading, the small wooden boxes holding letters from home. They cannot take these things with them. The sanctuary is failing, and they must leave their treasures to the deep. A boy desperately pulls a small, creased photograph from its frame, tucking the fragile piece of paper into the breast pocket of his shirt, pressing it tight against his chest. It is all he takes. It is all he needs. He leaves the rest behind, whispering a quiet apology to the empty room as the ship tilts further. Up on the flight deck, the world has tilted dangerously. The wooden planks, once so flat and reassuring, are now a steep hill leading down to the churning, oil-slicked water. The abandonment of the vessel is not a chaotic, pushing frenzy. It is a sorrowful, solemn farewell. The men move with a quiet, desperate purpose. They help one another adjust the heavy straps of their canvas life preservers, their hands working clumsy knots, their eyes meeting in silent, shared understanding. There are no grand speeches, only the quiet murmurs of brothers taking care of one another. "Is yours tight enough?" "Yes." "Stay close to me when we hit the water." "I will." They step to the edge of the iron precipice. They look down at the dark, waiting ocean. And then, they step off the edge of their broken world. The water is shockingly warm, a stark contrast to the cold fear gripping their hearts. They plunge beneath the surface, the sounds of the dying ship briefly muffled by the quiet embrace of the sea, before they bob back up into the smoke-filled air. They gather together in the water, a scattering of small, fragile lives floating amidst the vastness of the Pacific. They paddle toward one another, reaching out with oil-stained hands to grasp the shoulders of their friends. They form small, floating circles, binding themselves together against the pull of the current. A sailor who has lost his life preserver is struggling, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. Without a word, another boy swims to him, slipping one arm out of his own canvas vest and offering it to his friend. They share the buoyancy, kicking their legs together, a silent, beautiful testament to a love that is stronger than the fear of the deep. They float there, resting their chins on the canvas rings, and watch in heartbreaking silence as their floating island, their fortress, their home, finally surrenders. The great ship, mortally wounded, begins her final descent. She does not fight the water anymore. She slips beneath the waves with a slow, tragic dignity. The ocean rushes in to fill the empty spaces, extinguishing the fires, silencing the groaning metal, washing away the painted numbers and the wooden decks. Within moments, the massive steel giant is simply gone, leaving behind only a swirling vortex of bubbles and a profound, echoing emptiness on the surface. The young men are left entirely alone in the water. They are covered in the dark, heavy oil that bleeds from the sunken ship, their faces painted with the sorrow of survival. They look up. The beautiful, pastel dawn is gone. The morning sky is stained with the dark, drifting clouds of smoke. It looks as though the heavens themselves are weeping, shedding dark tears for the beautiful, fragile things that have been lost to the depths. But as the hours slowly pass, the wind begins to pick up. It is a gentle, soothing breeze that slowly pushes the smoke away, thinning the dark clouds until the blue sky begins to peek through once again. The ocean, entirely indifferent to the tragedies of men, settles back into its eternal, rhythmic breathing. The waves soften. The water around them returns to its mesmerizing, deep indigo. The boys drifting in the coral sea hold onto one another. They shiver in the gentle breeze, their hands tightly locked together. They do not speak. There are no words left to say. They simply hold on, feeling the steady beating of each other's hearts, finding their true sanctuary not in a mountain of steel, but in the quiet, unbreakable bonds of the boys floating beside them. They close their eyes against the glare of the morning sun, listening to the gentle sighing of the waves, and they wait for the horizon to bring them home. There is a profound and merciful grace in the setting of the sun, a gentle closing of the eyes that forces the weary world to finally be still. As evening approaches the vast expanse of the coral sea, the bruised and smoking sky slowly begins to soften. The harsh, blinding light of the afternoon fades into a deep, tender violet, and then, slowly, into an infinite, velvet black. The war, with all its tearing metal and roaring engines, is suddenly rendered blind in the dark. It cannot hunt what it cannot see. And so, the night imposes a mandatory, uneasy, and completely silent truce upon the waters. The great ships, scarred and exhausted from the trials of the day, slip quietly into the shadows. They become nothing more than massive, quiet ghosts gliding over the unseen waves. The ocean, entirely indifferent to the struggles of men, reclaims her ancient, rhythmic peace. The water slaps gently against the iron hulls, a rhythmic, soothing heartbeat that slowly lulls the racing pulses of the thousands of young men suspended above the abyss. Below the waterline, deep within the belly of the floating iron islands, the atmosphere completely changes. The bright, open terror of the endless sky is replaced by a warm, humming claustrophobia. The ships are blacked out, sealed tight against the night so that not a single sliver of light can escape and betray their position to the watching dark. The corridors and passageways are bathed in the soft, eerie glow of red battle lanterns. In this ruby twilight, the sailors move like shadows. They speak in hushed, reverent whispers, partly out of a bone-deep exhaustion, and partly out of a profound, instinctive respect for the silence of the sea outside their walls. The vibrant, chaotic energy of the morning has evaporated, leaving behind a heavy, thoughtful stillness. Men sit quietly on the cold linoleum floors of the passageways, their knees drawn up to their chests, leaning their tired heads against the vibrating steel bulkheads. They share whatever small comforts they have managed to hold onto. A crushed tin of peaches is passed carefully around a circle of boys, the sweet, sticky syrup a jarring, beautiful reminder of civilian life, of summer picnics and quiet Sunday afternoons. A young man, his hands still trembling slightly from the lingering adrenaline of the day, feels a heavy, scratchy wool blanket draped gently over his shoulders by a passing friend. No words are exchanged. None are needed. A soft pat on the shoulder, a meeting of tired eyes in the dim red light, it is a silent language of profound care, a promise that they are looking out for one another in the dark. But as the night stretches on, the quiet becomes heavy. It is pregnant with the unspoken, terrifying promise of what will happen when the sun rises again. They know the enemy is out there, somewhere in the black water, waiting for the dawn just as they are. And so, this becomes the quiet hour of the pen and the paper. In the dim, red corners of the ship, men sit on the edges of their narrow canvas bunks, balancing small, battered notepads on their knees. They uncap their fountain pens, the soft scratch of the metal nib against the paper joining the low hum of the ship's ventilation. This is not the casual, breezy correspondence of their outward journey weeks ago. The innocence of those early days has been burned away by the smoke and the fire. Tonight, every word carries the unbearable weight of a final goodbye, disguised as a simple greeting. What do you say to the people you love when you are standing on the edge of the world? With quiet, breathtaking courage, these young men choose to shield their families from the nightmare. They do not write of the burning ships. They do not describe the terrible sound of tearing steel or the cold grip of fear in their chests. They swallow their terror, pushing it down deep, and instead, they write of the mundane, the beautiful, and the eternal. Imagine a young aviator, his face pale in the red light, carefully forming the letters of his mother's name. He asks her about the garden she planted in the spring. He wonders if the tomatoes have ripened yet, and if the old dog still sleeps by the warm kitchen stove. He writes to his wife, tracing her name at the top of the page with a slow, deliberate tenderness, as if he can touch her cheek through the ink. He tells her that the stars over the Pacific are remarkably bright tonight, but that they do not hold a candle to the light in her eyes. He promises her that he is safe, that his friends are good to him, and that he will be home before the autumn leaves begin to fall. He folds the paper meticulously, matching the corners with quiet precision, sealing his love, his hopes, and his silent apologies inside the thin envelope. He places it in the breast pocket of his uniform, pressing it flat against his heart. It is a fragile, paper shield against the coming dawn. If the worst should happen, he wants his final act to be one of love, not of violence. Down in the cavernous, drafty expanse of the hangar deck, the aircraft rest in the shadows with their wings folded back, looking like great, sleeping birds of prey. The mechanics move quietly among them, their flashlights covered in red cellophane. They pat the cold aluminum flanks of the machines, checking the wires and the fuel lines one last time. It is an act of devotion. The pilots wander down into the hangar as well, unable to sleep. They stand alone in the dark, running their bare hands over the smooth propellers of their planes. They are making their peace with the machines that will carry them into the sky tomorrow. They lean their foreheads against the cold metal, whispering quiet, private promises to the engines. It is a sacred, silent communion between boy and machine, an acknowledgement that their fates are now entirely woven together. For those few who venture up through the heavy steel hatches to the weather decks, the view is staggering in its quiet majesty. Without the interference of city lights or the bright glow of a moon, the stars over the coral sea are a violent, glittering spray of diamond dust scattered across the absolute blackness. The Milky Way arches over the ocean like a glowing, celestial bridge, so close and so bright you feel you could reach up and brush the stardust with your fingertips. The air is cool and smells deeply of ancient salt and fresh wind. Looking out over the railings, there is no horizon. The black water simply blends into the black sky, creating a feeling of floating completely unmoored in the center of the universe. And the most haunting realization of all is that somewhere, across miles of dark, empty water, the boys on the other side are looking up at the exact same stars. They, too, are sitting in dimly lit rooms, breathing in the smell of machine oil and salt water. They, too, are holding photographs of smiling girls and proud parents. They are carefully folding their own letters, written in different characters but carrying the exact same gentle lies of safety and comfort. They share the same quiet dread of the morning, the same desperate longing for their own quiet streets and warm hearths. In the deep, forgiving dark, stripped of their flags and the painted symbols on their wings, they are all just boys, suspended over a fathomless abyss, held perfectly equal by the indifferent beauty of the night sky. As the midnight hour passes, exhaustion finally begins to claim them. The pens are capped. The letters are tucked away. The young men lie down in their narrow bunks, the ship swaying gently in the long, slow ocean swells. They close their eyes, listening to the deep, steady thrum of the engines far below, and the eternal, whispering sigh of the water parting against the steel hull. It is a lullaby older than humanity itself. They let the gentle rocking of the sea carry them away from the metal and the fear, drifting back to the green fields, the creaking porch swings, and the quiet, sunlit rooms of their memories. The darkness acts as a heavy, protective blanket, offering them a few precious, fleeting hours of absolute peace. The stars watch over them, silent and eternal guardians keeping a lonely vigil over the sleeping fleets. The boys rest in the quiet embrace of the night, breathing in unison with the sea, gathering their fragile, human strength for whatever the dawn may inevitably bring. There is a fragile, crystalline stillness just before the dawn, a moment when the ocean holds its breath and waits for the world to wake. In the deepest, quietest hours of the early morning, the darkness over the coral sea is absolute and profound. The great steel ships drift through this ink-black world like sleeping leviathans, their engines reduced to a slow, steady pulse that barely ripples the surface of the water. But as the clock ticks blindly forward, the sky at the very edge of the earth begins to change. The velvet black softens, bleeding into a bruised, deep purple. The stars, which had watched over the uneasy, silent truce of the night, begin to dim, closing their silver eyes one by one as a pale, peach-colored light spills slowly across the horizon. With the arrival of this soft, creeping dawn, the temporary peace of the darkness is gently lifted away. Deep within the cavernous bellies of the floating cities, the young men are already awake. Sleep, for most, was only a shallow, restless visitor anyway. Now, in the dim glow of the passageways, the ships begin to stir with a quiet, purposeful energy. There are no bugles here, no shouting, no dramatic calls to arms. There is only the soft shuffle of leather boots on cold linoleum floors, the quiet clatter of tin cups, and the low, muffled hum of hushed voices. It is the sound of thousands of boys preparing to leave the only home they have left. In the mess halls, the air is thick with the warm, comforting scent of strong coffee and toasted bread. The men sit shoulder to shoulder on long wooden benches, eating their breakfast in a solemn, thoughtful silence. They keep their eyes downcast, stirring their cups with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Some force a weak smile for a friend across the table, others simply stare at the white porcelain plates, lost in a labyrinth of their own memories. They are trying to hold onto the warmth of the coffee, letting it spread through their chests, a small, tangible comfort against the cold knot of anticipation resting in their stomachs. Down in the cramped berthing compartments, the pilots are getting dressed in the semi-darkness. It is a slow, methodical ritual, performed with the reverence of a religious ceremony. They pull on heavy wool socks, lace up their worn leather boots, and slip their arms into the heavy, shearling-lined flight jackets that smell of old sweat and aviation fuel. A young man, barely 20 years old, stands beside his narrow canvas bunk. He reaches under his pillow and withdraws a small, carefully folded square of paper. It is the letter he wrote the night before, filled with gentle lies about the beautiful weather and the peaceful sea, written to a mother who is currently sleeping halfway across the world. He smooths the edges of the paper with his thumb, reading his own handwriting one last time, before tucking it securely into the breast pocket of his uniform. He pats the fabric over his heart, making sure it is there. It is his talisman, his shield. He hopes that if he keeps her close to his heart, her love will somehow be enough to carry him through the empty sky. And across that same vast, uncaring ocean, aboard a ship with a different silhouette, another young man is performing the exact same quiet ritual. He sits in his own dimly lit quarters, drinking a cup of warm, bitter tea. He sets the porcelain cup down and reaches for a long, white strip of cotton fabric. It is a 1,000-stitch belt, painstakingly sewn by the women of his village, each red knot a silent prayer for his safe return. He wraps the cloth tightly around his waist, feeling the comforting pressure of 1,000 well wishes holding him together. He, too, misses the smell of his mother's kitchen. He, too, fears the vast, unfathomable depths of the dark water below. He, too, is just a boy, asked to carry the terrible weight of the world on his young, fragile shoulders. If you were to take away the painted symbols on their uniforms and the shapes of their ships, you would find no difference between them at all. They share the same trembling hands, the same quiet courage, and the same desperate, beautiful longing to simply live to see another sunrise. As the morning light strengthens, turning the ocean from black to a deep, mesmerizing indigo, the aviators begin to make their way up through the labyrinth of the ship to the flight deck. Stepping out into the open air is a shock to the senses. The wind across the flat, wooden expanse is sharp and clean, smelling intensely of salt and the vast emptiness of the Pacific. The sky is now a brilliant tapestry of spun gold and lavender, reflecting off the polished aluminum skins of the aircraft lined up in neat, silent rows. The mechanics are already there, the quiet, grease-stained guardians of the fleet. They have been up all night, tending to the metal birds with a gentle, obsessive devotion. As the pilots approach their machines, the mechanics step back. There is a profound, unspoken bond between these men. A mechanic wipes his hands on an oily rag, steps forward, and helps his young pilot climb into the cramped, cold cockpit. He reaches over the side, checking the harness, ensuring the straps are tight across the boy's chest. He doesn't offer grand speeches of glory. He simply rests his heavy, calloused hand on the boy's shoulder and gives it a firm, reassuring squeeze. It is a touch that says, "I have done everything I can. The machine is perfect. Now it is up to you." The pilot looks up through his leather helmet, his eyes meeting the mechanic's, and offers a slow, grateful nod. It is a small, passing moment of incredible grace, a tiny spark of human warmth in a world made of cold steel. Then, the silence of the morning is broken. The signal is given, and the engines begin to turn. It does not happen with a violent explosion of sound, but rather begins as a low, throbbing hum that originates deep within the metal chests of the aircraft. The propellers cough, stutter, and then catch, spinning into a beautiful, silver blur that catches the golden light of the dawn. The hum grows, building into a deep, resonant roar that vibrates through the wooden planks of the deck, traveling up through the boots of the men standing there, settling deep within their bones. It is the horizon's roar. A chorus of hundreds of mechanical heartbeats, powerful and overwhelming, filling the air with a thick, physical sound. Yet, in its own strange way, it is a soothing sound. It is the sound of purpose, the sound of motion, sweeping away the paralyzing anxiety of the long, silent night. One by one, the metal birds are released. They roll forward down the long, sloping wooden deck, gathering speed as the ocean wind catches beneath their heavy wings. There is a moment of breathless suspension as the wheels leave the edge of the ship, a split second where the aircraft seems to dip toward the rushing waves below, before the invisible hands of the air catch it, lifting it up into the endless blue. To watch them launch is to witness a terrifying but unimaginably beautiful dance. They rise into the morning sky like a flock of silver starlings, banking and turning in the golden light, finding their formations with a graceful, practiced elegance. They circle the great ships once, a silent salute to the floating islands that have sheltered them, before turning their noses toward the empty horizon. Inside the cockpits, the world suddenly becomes very small and very isolated. The deafening roar of the engine is a constant, steady companion, drowning out all other thoughts. The pilot sits in his vibrating metal shell, surrounded by the soft, glowing green dials of his instruments. The smell of high-octane fuel and hot oil fills his lungs. He looks out through the plexiglass canopy, and the sheer scale of the world is breathtaking. Below him, the ocean is a sprawling, endless canvas of rippling blue, broken only by the tiny, white scratches of the ship's wakes, which are rapidly shrinking into insignificance. Above him, the sky is a towering cathedral of light and scattered, puffy white clouds. It is so beautiful, so incredibly peaceful up here, far removed from the heavy burdens of the earth. He looks to his left and his right, seeing the painted wings of his friends flying beside him, perfectly suspended in the sky. They are entirely disconnected from the ocean far below, existing in a realm of breath, wind, and sudden, fleeting encounters. They do not know what awaits them behind the curve of the earth. They only know that they are together, a brotherhood of boys flying through a canvas of spun gold. The fleet is left behind, returning to the quiet rhythms of the sea. The mechanics stand on the empty flight deck, shielding their eyes against the sun, watching the tiny silver specks vanish into the distance until the sky is completely empty once again. The roar of the engine slowly fades away, replaced by the gentle sigh of the wind and the eternal wash of the waves against the hull. The morning sun climbs higher, warming the cold steel of the ships, illuminating a vast and different ocean that keeps its secrets hidden in the deep. The metal birds are gone, swallowed by the horizon, carrying with them the quiet letters, the hidden fears, and the gentle, unbreakable resilience of the boys who guide them through the endless, beautiful blue. There is a place far above the heavy earth where the world falls away entirely, leaving nothing but the wind, the light, and the beating of a solitary heart. When you leave the ocean behind, climbing higher and higher into the boundless dome of the sky, the reality of the water slowly dissolves. The vast, rolling Pacific, with all its hidden depths and creeping fleets, becomes nothing more than a painted floor of textured blue, impossibly distant and perfectly still. Up here, the world is reduced to breath, wind, and a profound, surreal isolation. The air at this altitude is thin and agonizingly cold. It bites through the thick shearling of the aviators' jackets and leaves a layer of delicate, fern-like frost on the inside of the plexiglass canopies. Inside these tiny, vibrating bubbles of glass and aluminum, the boys who pilot the machines are entirely alone. The roar of the engine, which had seemed so deafening on the wooden deck of the ship, changes as the air grows thin. It becomes a constant, droning hum, a white noise that wraps around the pilot like a heavy blanket. After an hour in the sky, the brain simply stops hearing it, replacing the mechanical roar with a deep, psychological silence. In this silence, a pilot can hear the rhythmic pull of his own breathing through his rubber oxygen mask. He can hear the blood rushing in his ears. He can feel the fragile, human pulse in his wrists as he grips the cold metal of the control stick. It is a beautiful, terrifying place to be. The sky is not just a backdrop, it is a towering geography of its own. There are massive, sweeping canyons of white clouds, rising up like marble cathedrals bathed in the brilliant, unblinking light of the sun. The shadows cast by these clouds are a deep, bruised violet. To fly among them is to feel as though you have slipped through a tear in the fabric of the world and entered a dream. In this dream, it is almost impossible to hold onto the concept of war. How can malice exist in a place of such profound, untouchable peace? A young pilot rests his head against the leather seat back, his eyes scanning the empty blue horizon. His hands move the controls with microscopic, unconscious corrections, the machine having become an extension of his own nervous system. To keep his mind from wandering too far into the terrifying vastness, he anchors himself to the small, tethered realities of his life. He thinks of the letter folded neatly in his breast pocket. He thinks of the girl who wrote it, remembering the way she laughed when the wind caught her hat on a pier back home. He remembers the smell of roasted peanuts and saltwater taffy. He can see the exact shade of her eyes, a color much warmer and kinder than the cold, brilliant cerulean of the stratosphere. He holds onto these memories fiercely, guarding them like a small, flickering candle in a massive, drafty room. But the dream of the high air is fragile, and the suddenness of the waking is a jarring, breathless thing. It happens without warning. From out of the blinding glare of the sun, or slipping silently from behind a towering mountain of white mist, the shapes appear. They do not look like machines of war at first. At this distance, against the staggering scale of the sky, they look like tiny, glittering seeds catching the light. They look like falling leaves of silver, twisting and drifting on an invisible autumn breeze. There is a moment of pure, suspended disbelief. The pilot watches them, his heart giving a single, hard thump against his ribs. The closing speed of the aircraft is immense, eating up the miles of empty space in mere seconds, yet to the human mind, time seems to stretch and slow to a surreal, agonizing crawl. The encounter is entirely disconnected from the ocean far below. There are no trenches here, no muddy fields, no places to hide. There is only speed, geometry, and the sudden, terrifying proximity of another human being. As the silver leaves grow larger, transforming into winged machines, the silent ballet begins. It is a dance of lethal grace, painted in sweeping arcs of white vapor that trail from the wingtips like silk ribbons. The planes dive and roll, turning tightly against the thin air, the sunlight flashing violently off their polished canopies. Inside the cockpits, the physical toll is immense. The invisible hand of gravity presses down on the boys, pulling the blood from their faces, making their limbs feel like lead. They grunt against the crushing weight, their eyes wide, their breath coming in short, strained gasps. Yet, there is a strange, detached beauty to it all. The tracer fire, arcing through the space between the aircraft, does not look like deadly ammunition. In the bright sunlight, it looks like a sudden flurry of glowing fireflies, floating lazily across the blue canvas. Because of the roaring wind and the hum of the engines, the engagement is fought in a surreal, muffled quiet. There are no echoing explosions, no shouts. Just the sudden, sharp thwack of metal tearing canvas, feeling more like a sudden jolt on a rough road than an act of violence. And then, in the midst of this chaotic, swirling dance, comes a moment of profound, heartbreaking clarity. Two aircraft, locked in a turning circle, pass each other at a distance of mere yards. The speed is blinding, but for a fraction of a heartbeat, the young pilot looks across the empty space and looks straight into the enemy cockpit. Through the smudged and frosted glass, he does not see a monster. He does not see a political ideology or an evil empire. He sees a boy. He sees a face framed by a leather flying helmet, half hidden by goggles and an oxygen mask. He sees a pair of wide, frightened eyes, mirroring his own absolute terror. He sees a boy whose hands are gripping the controls with the same white-knuckled desperation, a boy whose chest is heaving with the same ragged breath, a boy who likely has his own carefully folded letter tucked over his heart. In that fleeting, silent encounter, the entirety of the war simply evaporates. There is only a sudden, tragic recognition of shared humanity. They are two lonely children sent far away from their homes, pushed into the cold, uncaring sky to fight a battle they did not start. They are brothers in the boundless blue, caught in the exact same beautiful, terrible trap. The planes blur past one another, the moment breaking as quickly as a dropped glass. But the dance cannot last forever. Eventually, the silver leaves must fall. A plane is struck. It does not erupt in a grand, cinematic fireball. It simply loses its strength. A thin, dark ribbon of smoke begins to trail from the engine, a streak of black ink staining the pristine, pastel clouds. The aircraft's graceful arcs turn into a slow, sad, spiraling descent. It looks tired, a wounded bird finally surrendering to the pull of the earth. Inside the falling machine, a boy makes a desperate, quiet choice. He fights the heavy, jammed canopy, pushing it back against the rushing wind. He unbuckles his harness, stands up into the freezing gale, and lets the slipstream pull him away from his dying metal home. To the pilot still circling above, the sight is hauntingly beautiful. A small, dark figure tumbles through the air, and then, suddenly, a canopy of white silk blossoms against the sky. It opens like a delicate flower, catching the air, snapping taut with a silent grace. The boy suspended beneath the parachute is suddenly entirely alone. The roaring engines of the battle quickly fade away, leaving him in a world of absolute, breathtaking silence. The wind sighs softly through the nylon shroud lines above his head. He sways gently, a pendulum drifting down through the clouds. He looks up at the white silk, glowing in the sunlight, and then he looks down at the vast, uncaring expanse of the dark blue ocean rising slowly to meet him. He is alive, but he is terribly, profoundly isolated, floating downward like a dandelion seed caught on a summer breeze. High above him, the sky begins to empty. The fuel gauges on the glowing instrument panels dictate an end to the fleeting encounter. The surviving aircraft pull away, breaking their circles, turning their noses back toward the empty horizon. The sudden cessation of the dance is just as jarring as its beginning. The silver leaves scatter, swallowed once again by the vastness of the heavens. The young pilot, flying alone once more, feels the adrenaline drain from his body, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache in his bones. His hands tremble so badly he can barely hold the stick. He reaches up, pulling his oxygen mask down for just a moment, taking a deep, shuddering breath of the freezing air. He presses his gloved hand against his chest, feeling the reassuring crinkle of the paper beneath the heavy leather. It is still there. He is still here. He looks back over his shoulder one last time. The sky is perfectly clear. The white vapor trails have already dissipated, dissolved by the wind. The clouds remain untouched, towering, and majestic. The heavens hold no scars. They keep no memory of the boys who flew there, of the terrified eyes meeting through the glass, or of the falling leaves of silver. The world is reduced once more to breath, wind, and the solitary pulse of his own heart. He leans his head back, closing his tired eyes for just a second, and lets the steady, humming lullaby of the engine carry him slowly toward the fading light of the horizon, forever changed by the beautiful, terrible dream of the high air. There is a moment when a mountain of steel ceases to be a fortress and becomes simply a fragile, wounded thing, trembling in the vastness of the sea. Deep within the cavernous bellies of the great aircraft carriers, the war had always felt like a distant, abstract storm. These ships were floating cities, complete with their own quiet neighborhoods, their own bakeries that smelled of warm yeast in the early hours, and their own narrow, brightly lit streets lined with lockers and canvas bunks. For the young men living below the waterline, the thick wooden flight deck above their heads was a ceiling, a heavy wooden roof that kept the vast, terrifying sky safely locked away. Down here, life was measured in the rhythmic, comforting hum of the massive engines, the soft hiss of steam pipes, and the gentle, perpetual swaying of the ocean. A boy could sit in the corner of the mess hall, carefully polishing his boots or reading a tattered, beloved book, and almost forget that he was suspended over a bottomless abyss. The ship was his protector. It was a maternal, breathing giant that wrapped him in warm steel and carried him safely through the dark. But then, the outside world finally reaches the wooden roof. It does not announce itself with a theatrical crash. It begins as a deep, agonizing shudder that originates from the very top of the world and travels downward, rushing through the iron beams and the steel bulkheads. It is a tremor so profound that it bypasses the ears entirely and settles directly into the bones. The floor suddenly drops a fraction of an inch beneath their boots. The giant ship lets out a long, metallic groan, a sound of immense, structural sorrow, as if the floating city itself is crying out in pain. The illusion of the impenetrable fortress shatters in an instant. The bright, cheerful incandescent lights flicker, buzz like startled insects, and then die entirely, plunging the labyrinth of corridors into a sudden, breathless twilight. A second later, the emergency battle lanterns click on, bathing the passageways in a soft, eerie, blood-red glow. From the ceiling, decades of paint chips and fine dust shake loose from the rafters, drifting down through the red light like a quiet, pale snow. The air pressure shifts, popping in the boy's ears, and the atmosphere inside the ship changes. The comforting smells of baked bread and machine oil are suddenly chased away by the sharp, metallic tang of ozone, the bitter scent of burning wood, and the cold, damp breath of the ocean rushing into places it was never meant to be. Up in the massive hangar deck, the tremor tears through the quiet rows of resting airplanes. Sparks rain down from the severed electrical cables above, falling like a shower of golden, weeping willows in the dimness. Small fires begin to bloom, casting dancing, erratic shadows against the bulkheads. In this moment of sudden, overwhelming chaos, you might expect to find panic. You might expect to find young men running blindly for the safety of the open air. But the human heart, when pressed against the anvil of disaster, often reveals a quiet, astonishing grace. The mechanics, the grease-stained guardians of the machines, do not run. They look at the falling sparks, they look at the growing flames, and they think only of the boys sleeping in the compartments below them. They move with a deliberate, hushed urgency. There is no shouting, only the swift, wordless communication of brothers who know exactly what must be done. A young man, his face smeared with soot, grabs a heavy canvas fire hose. The water pressure is gone, the pumps knocked silent by the tremor. He doesn't hesitate. He drops the hose and runs toward a burning aircraft. He throws his own heavy, sweat-soaked uniform jacket over the flames, beating them down with his bare hands. The heat blisters his skin, but he does not feel it. He feels only a fierce, protective love for his floating home. Beside him, 3 other boys put their shoulders against the fuselage of a crippled plane that is inching dangerously close to a pool of spilled fuel. They dig their boots into the slick, wet metal of the deck, their faces pale and strained in the red light, and they push. They push in absolute, agonizing silence, their breath coming in ragged gasps, until the heavy machine rolls safely away from the danger. They collapse against the wheels, coughing in the smoke, wrapping their soot-stained arms around one another. It is a profound, unseen act of immense bravery, performed not for medals or glory, but simply because it is what you do when your family is in danger. Deeper still, in the very heart of the wounded city, lies the sick bay. When the tremor struck, the glass bottles of medicine rattled and danced on their stainless steel shelves, a few vibrating over the edge to shatter softly on the linoleum floor. The young medics, boys who had trained in brightly lit classrooms far away from the sea, are suddenly faced with the reality of their calling. The heavy steel doors open, and their friends are brought in from the smoke-filled corridors above. They are coughing, their uniforms torn, their faces etched with shock. The sick bay becomes a sanctuary of hushed voices and incredibly gentle hands. A corpsman, no older than 19, kneels beside a sailor who is lying on a canvas stretcher. The wounded boy is trembling violently, his eyes wide and unseeing, lost in the terrifying echo of the ship's groan. The corpsman does not reach for a bandage or a needle first. He reaches for the boy's hand. He takes the trembling, well-stained fingers in his own clean ones, and he holds on with a warm, steady pressure. "I've got you," the corpsman whispers, his voice smooth and calming, cutting through the distant alarms and the hiss of escaping steam. "You are safe now. I am right here with you." He takes a cool, damp cloth and slowly, meticulously, begins to wipe the soot from his friend's forehead. He works with the tenderness of a mother soothing a feverish child. "Close your eyes," he murmurs, leaning in close so the boy can hear him over the noises of the ship. "Think of the rain on the roof back home. Think of the cool wind. Just breathe with me." And the wounded boy listens. He focuses on the rhythm of the corpsman's breathing, the steady, grounding anchor of another human soul sitting with him in the dark. The violent trembling begins to slow. His eyes close, and a single, quiet tear tracks down through the remaining dust on his cheek. The medicine will come later. Right now, the only cure that matters is the simple, overwhelming kindness of a stranger who refuses to let him be alone. Throughout the floating city, these quiet acts of everyday heroism bloom like small, bright flowers in the ash. Men share the last swallows of water from their canteens. They guide one another through the darkened passageways, a hand resting lightly on the shoulder in front of them, a human chain of trust winding through the dark. In a flooded corridor, ankle-deep in dark, cold seawater, a sailor sloshing his way toward the pump spots something pale floating in the debris. He pauses, reaching down into the cold water. It is a piece of paper, blown free from a shattered locker. The ink is already beginning to run, bleeding into soft, blue watercolor shapes across the page. It is a letter. He doesn't know who wrote it, or who was meant to read it. But he knows what it represents. He knows the delicate hopes and the quiet fears folded into those dissolving words. With immense care, he shakes the water from the page, folds it neatly into a small square, and tucks it deep into his dry breast pocket. He cannot save the locker, and he cannot fix the breached hull, but he can save this small, fragile piece of someone's heart. He carries it with him into the dark, a tiny, salvaged treasure. The great carrier continues to shudder as the hours stretch on, her massive frame settling uneasily into the water. She is bruised, she is bleeding smoke into the morning sky, and her wooden decks are scarred by the terrible reality of the world above. But she does not sink. She holds together, not just because of the strength of her iron rivets or the thickness of her steel plates. She holds together because of the boys inside her. They are the true framework of the floating city. Their quiet resilience, their shared burdens, and their profound, whispered acts of grace weave a net of human spirit that catches the falling ship and holds her steady. As the smoke slowly begins to clear from the passageways, and the emergency lights cast their long, soft shadows against the bulkheads, the young men sit together on the cold floors. They lean their tired heads against each other's shoulders. They are exhausted, their faces painted with the grime of survival, but there is a new, quiet strength in their eyes. They have felt the tremor, they have seen the floating city wounded, and they have discovered that they are the ones who can make it whole again. They listen to the slow, steady hum of the remaining engines, a heartbeat they have saved with their own hands, and they wait in the gentle, protective embrace of one another for the calming of the sea. There is a heartbreaking kind of peace that settles over the world when a long and desperate struggle finally comes to an end. For hours, the young men deep within the belly of the majestic ship have fought with everything they have. They have battled the smoke, the encroaching heat, and the rising water with a fierce, protective love for their floating home. Their faces are painted with black soot, their hands are blistered, and their uniforms are heavy with the cold salt of the Pacific. They have given her their strength, their sweat, and their unwavering devotion. But there comes a quiet, heavy moment when they realize that it is simply not enough. The grand ship, a towering island of steel and wood that has carried them faithfully across thousands of miles of empty ocean, is mortally wounded. The fires burning deep within her lower decks have grown too bright, too fierce to be tamed. She is tired. You can feel it in the way the great steel bulkheads groan, a slow, metallic sigh that vibrates through the soles of their boots. She is slowly, gracefully surrendering to the heavy, inevitable pull of the deep. To understand the profound sorrow of this moment, you must understand what a ship truly is to the men who sail her. She is never just a machine of war. She is a living, breathing sanctuary. She is the warm, humming walls that keep the terrifying vastness of the ocean at bay. She is the narrow canvas bunk where a boy dreams of his mother's kitchen. She is the dim, red-lit passageway where he reads, over and over again, a fragile letter from a girl with a ribbon in her hair. To lose her is to lose the very ground beneath their feet. It is to be made suddenly, terrifyingly homeless in the center of an endless blue void. When the final order is given to abandon ship, it does not come with the frantic, piercing shriek of an alarm bell. It is not shouted in panic. It is passed softly, gently, from man to man, down through the darkened corridors and up across the slanting wooden decks. It is time to go. The phrase moves through the crew like a quiet breeze. And in response, there is no chaos. There is no desperate scramble for the edges. Instead, a surreal, profoundly solemn calm washes over the men. They move with the quiet, respectful grace of a congregation slowly leaving a church at the end of a long service. Down in the berthing compartments, where the dark water is already beginning to lap against the linoleum floors, the boys return to their lockers one last time. They wade through the rising tide to open those small metal doors. They know they cannot carry much. The heavy wool blankets, the extra pairs of boots, the books they meant to finish, all of it must be left behind to the sea. They make their choices with trembling, soot-stained hands. A young sailor reaches past his neatly folded uniforms and takes only a small, leather-bound Bible and a photograph of his little sister standing on a porch. Another boy unpins a tiny, hand-stitched four-leaf clover from the inside of his locker door, tucking it carefully into the breast pocket of his shirt, pressing it flat against his beating heart. They close the metal doors softly, a final, quiet click echoing in the flooded room, and they whisper their apologies to the space that sheltered them for so long. As the men gather on the flight deck, the world tilts gently beneath them. The great ship is listing, her flat, wooden expanse becoming a long, slow hill leading down to the water. The smoke rising from her center is thick, but the ocean breeze pushes it away, leaving the air strangely clear and bright under the afternoon sun. It is here, on this slanting deck, in the face of absolute tragedy, that one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking moments of the war takes place. Down in the ship's galley, the giant freezers have lost their power. Inside them are gallons and gallons of ice cream, a precious, rare luxury meant for quiet Sunday evenings or celebrations of crossing the equator. The cooks, recognizing the beautiful absurdity of the moment, refuse to let it simply melt away into the dark. They pry open the heavy freezer doors, carrying the large cardboard tubs up the steep stairs into the light. Word spreads across the tilting deck. The men, exhausted, filthy, and preparing to step off the edge of their world, pause. They gather around the cooks, forming quiet, orderly lines. There are no bowls left, no proper spoons. It doesn't matter. They take the ice cream in tin coffee cups and the upturned covers of their canteens, and sometimes simply in their bare, cupped hands. They sit down on the edge of the flight deck, their legs dangling freely over the side, looking out at the vast, waiting ocean. Imagine the sight of it. Hundreds of young men, their faces dark with the ash of a terrible battle, sitting together on a dying ship, eating melting vanilla and strawberry ice cream. The sweet, cold cream coats their throats, soothing the harsh burn of the smoke. It melts over their knuckles, a sticky, wonderful reminder of summer afternoons, of county fairs, of a world so soft and gentle it feels like a dream. They share bites with one another, offering a spoonful to a friend whose hands are too badly burned to hold a cup. They laugh, a soft, weary sound that gets carried away on the wind. For a few precious, golden minutes, the war simply ceases to exist. They are not sailors, or warriors, or castaways. They are just boys again, sitting on the porch steps of the world, eating a sweet treat on a hot afternoon. It is an act of quiet, beautiful defiance against the darkness. It is a celebration of life, right on the precipice of the abyss. But the ship continues her slow, heavy lean. The ocean is calling to her, and she can no longer resist the pull. It is time to say the final farewell. Thick, rough manila ropes are draped over the side of the deck, trailing down into the deep blue water. The men stand up, wiping the sweet cream and the soot from their mouths with the backs of their sleeves. They adjust the canvas straps of their life preservers, checking the knots for their friends. The descent is slow and methodical. There is no pushing. You first, a boy whispers, stepping back to let an older sailor take the rope. They lower the wounded with agonizing care, tying the ropes around the stretchers, guiding them down the sheer steel cliff of the hull with gentle hands, calling out soft encouragements as they go. When a young man finally takes the rope in his own hands, he feels the rough, familiar bite of the hemp fibers against his palms. He looks out at the horizon, takes a long, deep breath of the salt air, and begins to climb down. The steel wall of the ship slides past him, still warm from the fires inside, a giant radiator radiating a comforting, tragic heat. He slips beneath the surface of the water, and it is shockingly warm, a soft, Pacific embrace that washes the heavy black soot from his uniform. He bobs back up to the surface, the canvas preserver holding him tight, and he paddles away from the steel cliff, joining the floating constellation of his brothers in the gentle swells. They drift outward, forming small, quiet clusters in the water. They hold onto one another, linking arms, resting their tired chins on the canvas rings. And then, they turn back to look. The majestic ship sits low in the water, her beautiful silhouette framed against the vast, open sky. She looks incredibly lonely. From her vents, thick white steam begins to escape, hissing softly into the air. To the boys floating in the water, it sounds like a long, exhausted sigh. It is the breath leaving her lungs. They watch as the water begins to wash over the places they know so well. The ocean creeps up the side of the hull, swallowing the painted numbers that gave her a name. It washes over the lower weather decks, where they used to stand on quiet, starry nights and talk about the girls back home. It rushes over the wooden planks of the flight deck, taking the empty cardboard tubs of ice cream, washing the wood clean of the smoke and the ash. The abandonment is entirely peaceful. She does not plunge violently into the depths. She does not tear herself apart. She simply bows her head, heavy with the weight of the water, and slowly, gracefully, glides downward. The men in the water do not speak. The silence is profound and heavy, a physical weight resting on their chests. A few men quietly weep, their tears mixing with the warm salt of the ocean, mourning the loss of the Iron Mother who kept them safe in the dark. A boy reaches up and touches his chest, feeling the comforting lump of the photograph in the 4-leaf clover he managed to save. They watch until the very last piece of the ship's mast slips beneath the surface, leaving nothing but a swirl of white foam and a few floating pieces of wood. And then, the ocean simply smooths itself out. The ripples fade. The deep blue water returns to its perfect, unbroken rhythm, entirely indifferent to the majestic thing it has just consumed. The sea remembers nothing, but the men remember everything. They are left floating in the vastness, suspended between the brilliant sky and the fathomless deep. They are entirely alone in the world now, stripped of their fortress, their warm beds, and their sanctuary. Yet, as they look around at the floating circles of their friends, they realize they are not truly lost. They survived. They hold onto the hands of the boys beside them, feeling the steady, reassuring pulse of life in their grip. The ship is gone, resting in the quiet, eternal dark of the ocean floor, but she has done her job. She held on long enough to give her boys back to the light. The sun begins to lower toward the horizon, casting a long, golden path across the water. The young men float in the gentle, rocking swells, resting their tired heads, and they wait in the quiet peace of the afternoon, carrying the memory of the Grand Iron Lady forever in their hearts. There is a sudden, breathless wait to the wind when the sky finally clears, leaving only the quiet echo of a storm that has passed. The ocean, after a tempest of iron and fire, does not hold onto the violence. It simply absorbs the scars, swallows the broken pieces of the world, and returns to its slow, rhythmic breathing. But for the boys left floating on its surface, the world has been forever altered. They bob in the gentle swells, surrounded by a thick, iridescent slick of black oil that smells sharply of the deep earth and burnt metal. The dark oil coats their hair, their pale faces, and the heavy canvas of their life preservers. It turns them into silent, dark statues, drifting together in a vast, indifferent blue universe. The sun begins its slow descent, turning the sky into a staggering canvas of bruised purple and soft, melancholic gold. The warmth of the afternoon gives way to a creeping, profound chill. It is the chill of exhaustion, of the adrenaline finally leaving the blood, leaving behind only the fragile, trembling reality of the human body. They hold onto one another, these oil-stained boys. They link their slippery arms, forming small, floating islands of humanity. They do not speak. The vastness of the sea presses against their throats, and the sheer miracle of their own breathing demands absolute silence. Then, cutting through the quiet wash of the waves, comes the low, steady thrum of engines. It is not the terrifying, high-pitched roar from the clouds, but the beautiful, deep, thumping heartbeat of salvation. The rescue ships, the smaller escorts and sleek cruisers that have survived the tempest, come gliding carefully through the slick, dark waters. To the boys floating in the debris, those scarred gray hulls look like the most magnificent, heavenly monuments ever built. Heavy cargo nets made of thick, rough manila rope are unrolled over the sides of the rescue ships, splashing softly into the water. Sailors lean far over the steel railings, reaching down with desperate, open hands. "We have you," they call out, their voices hushed but cracking with raw emotion. "Just grab the net. We have you." The boys in the water are so unimaginably tired. Their arms feel like solid lead. Their fingers, slick with the heavy oil and numbed by the cold sea, can barely close around the rough ropes. But they are not left to climb alone. The men on the decks pull. They heave the heavy nets upward, their boots sliding on the wet decks, hauling their brothers out of the heavy grasp of the ocean. As they are pulled over the railings and collapse onto the solid steel decks, the true weight of their survival settles over them. There is no cheering. There is no triumphant music playing in the salty air. There is only the quiet, heavy sound of ragged breathing, the dripping of seawater, and the soft, shuffling footsteps of the rescue crews. The survivors cannot stand. They sit on the cold metal, their knees drawn tightly to their chests, shivering uncontrollably. The rescue crews move among them like quiet, gentle spirits. They bring armfuls of heavy, scratchy wool blankets, wrapping them tightly around the trembling shoulders of the survivors. A young cook, his white apron stained with soot, carries a large metal pot of steaming clear broth out onto the weather deck. He kneels beside a boy whose eyes are wide and hollow, staring straight through the bulkhead at a horizon only he can see. The cook fills a battered tin cup and wraps the boy's blackened, shaking hands around it. The heat of the metal is a sharp, wonderful shock against the freezing skin. "Drink," the cook whispers softly, his voice trembling just a little. "Just small sips. It will warm you from the inside out." The boy takes a sip, closing his eyes as the warm broth washes away the bitter taste of salt and oil. A single, clean tear cuts a line through the thick black soot on his cheek. It is a small, quiet moment of everyday heroism, one boy gently feeding another, tethering a wandering soul back to the world of the living with nothing more than a cup of warm soup and a soft voice. Nearby, a medic kneels with a clean, damp cloth, carefully wiping the thick oil from the eyes of a young aviator who was pulled from the wreckage. The medic works with the utmost tenderness, murmuring quiet words of comfort, wiping away the darkness so the boy can finally see the golden light of the setting sun. When the aviator opens his red, stinging eyes and sees the face of his caretaker, he reaches out and weakly grips the medic's wrist, offering a silent, desperate nod of gratitude. As the shivering begins to slowly subside beneath the heavy wool blankets, the quiet shock takes hold. A sailor, resting against a warm ventilation duct, slowly reaches into the pocket of his soaked, ruined uniform. His fingers tremble as he pulls out a sodden, heavy mass of paper. It was a letter from his father, folded and carried across thousands of miles. The ink has completely washed away in the salt water, leaving nothing but a blank, fragile pulp. He stares at it for a long time in the fading light. He does not cry for the lost words, because he knows every single one of them by heart. He presses the ruined paper to his chest, closing his eyes, crying because he suddenly understands, with crushing, breathtaking clarity, how incredibly close he came to never seeing the man who wrote them again. As the last of the survivors are gently carried below decks, the rescue ships slowly turn their prows. They join the rest of the battered fleet. These surviving ships are not the pristine, proud, untouchable vessels that sailed out of the harbors under the cover of night weeks ago. They are deeply scarred. Their gray paint is blistered and scorched by fire, their metal twisted by near misses, their decks carrying the heavy, silent memories of the long days before. Slowly, deliberately, the fleet turns away from the battlefield. They leave the waters where so much was lost, pointing their compasses away from the sun, toward the distant, unseen safety of the harbors and the incredibly long journey home. As they turn, the evening wind catches their superstructures. It is a gentle wind, but to the men standing quietly on the decks, looking back at the empty, darkening expanse of the coral sea, it feels unimaginably heavy. It is the weight of the wind, laden with the profound silence of the missing. Looking back at the empty horizon, the survivors realize that the ocean gives no sign of the struggle. The water simply ripples and reflects the fading light, keeping its secrets locked away in the sunless depths. The realization of who is not standing on the deck beside them begins to press down on their chests. Down in the sleeping quarters, the reality of survival is a quiet, aching thing. The rows of canvas bunks are only partially full. The empty spaces are loud with the absence of the boys who used to occupy them. A sailor walks slowly past the bunk of his closest friend. He sees the neatly folded civilian sweater left at the foot of the bed, waiting for a chill that will never come. He sees a small, leather-bound journal resting perfectly on the center of the pillow. He reaches out and gently touches the cover of the journal. He lets his hand rest there in the dim red light, a silent, heartbroken farewell to a boy who shared his coffee, who laughed at his terrible jokes, and who will now remain forever in the deep blue. The silence of the missing is louder than the thrumming engines beneath their feet. There is a profound, sprawling exhaustion that comes with surviving. It is a tiredness that reaches past the muscles and bones, settling deep into the very soul. The boys who were pulled from the water do not want to talk about the roaring skies, the falling silver leaves, or the groaning of sinking ships. They just want to listen to the slow, steady hum of the engines. They want to feel the solid, unyielding deck beneath their boots. They want to close their eyes and know, with absolute certainty, that they will open them again in the morning. As the sun finally dips below the edge of the world, pulling the last golden ribbons of light with it, the ocean turns to a deep, mesmerizing black. The stars emerge, the exact same familiar, brilliant tapestry of diamond dust that has watched over them every night. The battered fleet glides through the darkness, entirely blacked out, a procession of quiet, weary ghosts moving gracefully across the water. The survivors lie in their borrowed bunks, wrapped tightly in their wool blankets, the faint taste of salt still lingering on their lips. They listen to the gentle wash of the waves against the hull. They are quiet, and they are changed forever. The innocence they carried out of the harbors has been left behind, swallowed by the sea. They carry a new, quiet wisdom now, born of fire, oil, and water. They know now the true fragility of iron and the astonishing, unbreakable strength of the human heart. They know the infinite value of a shared cup of warm broth, the immense comfort of a hand on a shoulder in the dark, and the absolute, staggering miracle of simply drawing another breath. The coral sea slowly fades into the distance behind them, its waters smoothing over under the starlight. The heavy wind blows across the empty waves, finding no majestic ships to push against, no metal rigging to whistle through. It simply moves across the surface of the world, a gentle, eternal sigh, while the bruised and battered boys of the fleet finally, mercifully, drift into a deep, dreamless, and lasting sleep. There is a profound and comforting truth in the way water eventually heals itself, smoothing over the heaviest of scars as if they were never there at all. When the great ships finally turned away, taking the shivering survivors and the heavy burdens of the living with them, the coral sea was left alone to tend to her wounds. For a few brief days, the surface bore the marks of the terrible intrusion. Dark ribbons of oil drifted aimlessly on the slow currents, catching the sunlight in fractured, melancholic rainbows. Pieces of splintered wood, torn canvas, and the small, floating detritus of human lives bobbed quietly in the swells. But the ocean is remarkably patient, and the ocean is infinitely vast. With every passing hour, the gentle, rhythmic sweeping of the tides began to work their slow, erasing magic. The tropical winds dispersed the lingering smoke, washing the sky clean until it was once again a flawless, towering dome of cerulean blue. The currents, moving like slow, invisible hands, gently pulled the oil apart, thinning it out until it vanished completely into the deep. The water, which had been torn and boiled and battered by the engines of men, simply settled. It returned to its mesmerizing, deep indigo, flawlessly reflecting the passing clouds, showing absolutely no memory of the fire that had burned there. Far below the sunlit surface, down in the quiet, eternal twilight of the ocean floor, the great iron giants found their final resting places. The majestic ships, the floating cities that had been so full of light and noise and young, beating hearts, now rested in absolute, unbroken silence. They settled softly into the fine white sand, their massive steel hulls slowly beginning the long journey of becoming part of the earth once again. Down here, there is no war. There is no fear, and there is no waiting for the dawn. The cold metal began to soften under the heavy, peaceful blanket of the deep. It is a beautiful, quiet transformation. The sharp edges of torn iron are slowly covered by the delicate, blossoming spread of deep water coral. Tiny, luminescent fish dart through the open hatches, exploring the dark corridors that were once lit by the anxious red glow of battle lanterns. The cavernous hangar decks, where mechanics once rushed and engines roared with desperate life, are now peaceful caverns filled only with the slow, graceful movement of the tides. The terrible weapons of men have been gently disarmed by the sea, turned into quiet, enduring monuments, resting forever in the dark, comforting embrace of the deep blue. And what of the boys who stayed behind? The young men who slipped beneath the surface, leaving their heavy boots and their private fears on the slanting decks above. They are not lost in the cold. They are cradled. They are held in the gentle, weightless suspension of the sea. They belong now to the eternal rhythm of the tides, their gentle spirits woven into the very fabric of the ocean they fought upon. They are in the soft, peach-colored light of the dawn that spills across the water every morning. They are in the glittering, ghostly trails of bioluminescence that glow in the wake of passing ships. They are in the quiet, whispering wind that rustles the palm fronds on the distant, emerald islands. They traded their scratchy wool uniforms and their terrified, racing hearts for a profound and lasting peace. They are forever young, forever suspended in that moment of ultimate devotion, guarded by the silent, majestic ships that sleep beside them in the dark. While the sea was busy washing away the physical scars, a different kind of echo was making its slow, poignant journey across the world. Weeks after the clouds had cleared over the Pacific, small, heavy canvas bags of mail were being quietly unloaded on distant wooden docks and bustling train stations. These were the letters written by dim red lights, the folded squares of paper carried in breast pockets, the final, whispered thoughts of boys who had already found their peace. Imagine a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, thousands of miles away from any ocean, where the air smells of cut grass and blooming spring lilacs. A mother stands on her wooden front porch, wiping her hands on her apron, as the postman hands her a slightly crumpled white envelope. She recognizes the handwriting immediately. It is her son's. Her heart flutters with a sudden, desperate hope, even though the heavy, formal telegram had arrived days before. She sits down on the porch swing, her fingers trembling as she carefully breaks the seal. She reads his words. He does not tell her about the roaring sky or the terrifying, falling leaves of silver. He tells her that the stars over the water are breathtakingly bright. He tells her that he misses her cooking, and he asks if the old dog is still sleeping by the warm kitchen stove. It is a beautiful, heartbreaking miracle. It is a soft voice reaching out from the deep, traveling through time to offer one last, gentle embrace. These letters become sacred, cherished relics. They are tucked safely into the pages of family Bibles, kept in small wooden boxes on bedside tables, and read softly in the quiet, lonely hours of the night. The ink may slowly fade, the fragile edges worn soft by years of loving, tracing touches, but the quiet courage captured in those words remains as enduring and vast as the ocean itself. They are the true legacy of the boys in the Coral Sea, not the metal they flew or the ships they sailed, but the quiet, simple love they managed to send home. When the surviving boys finally stepped off the trains and onto the platforms of their hometowns, they were greeted with tears and tight, desperate embraces. Their mothers held them, feeling the new, rigid tension in their young shoulders. Their sweethearts kissed their cheeks, noticing the distant, quiet look that now lived behind their eyes. They tried their best to fold themselves back into the soft, civilian lives they had dreamed of in the dark. They took off their heavy uniforms, putting on their old canvas trousers and worn cotton shirts. They sat at the family dinner tables, listening to the clatter of silverware and the innocent chatter of everyday life. But there was always a part of them that remained out on the water. In the quiet moments, when a sudden summer thunderstorm rattled the window panes, or when a tea kettle whistled sharply on the stove, they would be instantly transported back to the trembling steel corridors. They carried the profound, lingering exhaustion of survival and the heavy, invisible burden of knowing exactly how fragile a human life truly is. When they were asked what it was like, they didn't speak of the horrors. They spoke instead of the quiet heroism. They wouldn't talk about the roaring engines or the burning water. They would talk about the older mechanic who offered a reassuring hand on a trembling shoulder. They would talk about the cook who held a tin cup of clear water to a frightened boy's lips. They took the terrible, sweeping history of the battle and reduced it down to its most beautiful, human elements. They kept the memory of the light, and they tried their very best to forgive the dark. Just as the ocean takes a broken, jagged piece of glass, tumbling it over and over in the sand and the tide until it becomes a smooth, beautiful jewel, time slowly softened the sharp edges of their grief. The sea had taught them that even after the most violent and terrifying storms, the water always calms. The sky always clears. The world, despite all its tearing and breaking, eventually finds a way to heal. Years later, an old man might walk alone along a quiet stretch of beach. He wears a thick, knitted sweater against the coastal chill, leaning slightly on a wooden cane. He stops at the edge of the surf, letting the cold, foaming water wash over the toes of his shoes. He looks out at the horizon, staring at the exact same blue expanse that once held his entire world. He doesn't see the mirages anymore. He doesn't look for the shadows of enemy fleets or the dark silhouettes of falling planes. Instead, he sees the faces of his friends. He hears the quiet laughter over a shared cup of melting ice cream. He feels the reassuring weight of a hand pulling him from the oil-slicked waves. He remembers the incredible, unbreakable bond forged in the fires of the deep. He stands there, a quiet survivor of history, and he speaks softly to the wind. He whispers the names of the boys who stayed behind. He tells them about the long life he lived for them. He tells them about his children, his grandchildren, and the quiet, peaceful years he was given. He knows that the ocean connects this shore to the silent resting places halfway across the world. He knows that the water touching his feet is part of the same eternal sea that cradles his brothers. He offers a slow, grateful nod to the empty horizon, making his final peace with the water, before turning back toward the warmth of his home. The coral sea remembers nothing of the battle. It does not hold grudges, and it does not keep records of human sorrow. It simply exists, vast, beautiful, and eternal. If you were to sail those waters today, you would find only peace. You would see the seabirds gliding effortlessly on the warm, tropical thermals, their white wings bright against the blue. You would see the flying fish breaking the surface, skipping like polished silver stones across the gentle swells. You would feel the exact same soft, salt-heavy breeze that kissed the cheeks of the young aviators so many years ago. As the sun sets, the sky ignites in a breathtaking display of violet, crimson, and gold, a daily masterpiece painted just for the quiet ocean. The light slowly fades, surrendering to the deep, enveloping velvet of the night. The stars emerge, the same ancient, glittering constellations that watched over the darkened fleets, shining their cold, clear light down on the water. The ocean breathes. It rises and falls in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, a lullaby that has been playing since the dawn of the earth. It sings for the ancient coral reefs, it sings for the distant shores, and it sings for the sleeping iron giants hidden in the dark. And in that gentle, endless song, the memories of the boys are kept safe. They are no longer sailors or soldiers. They are a part of the profound, untouchable beauty of the world. They are at rest in the deep, wrapped tightly in the quiet, eternal embrace of the sea, sleeping peacefully under the watchful, loving light of a million stars.